Hey there, tonight we're uncovering the real story of Vasco da Gama's daring journey to India, where the truth is the sea was both his greatest ally and fiercest adversary. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the bustling town of Sines, Portugal, where the scent of salt water mixed with the chatter of ambitious merchants, young Vasco da Gama was busy not being the legend he'd become. There he was, a kid with a future as predictable as a Portuguese weather report, cloudy with a chance of empire. Born around 1460, Vasco was the third son of Estevão da Gama, a knight of the household of Infante Dom Fernando, Duke of Viseu. Now, being the third son in a feudal household was like being the third slice of bread in a sandwich. Important, but not the centerpiece. It pushed Vasco to carve out a niche where he could be more than just a footnote in the family history. Vasco's early life was a cocktail of medieval politics and seafaring ambition, stirred with a dash of fate. Portugal in the late 15th century was like a teenager with a new driver's license, eager to explore but not entirely sure of the route. The age of exploration was a direct result of this youthful exuberance, mixed with a desperate economic need to find new trade routes. You see, the Silk Road had become a silk roadblock, thanks to the Ottoman Empire, which had a monopoly on the spice trade that was making European merchants as frustrated as a cat in a rainstorm. They needed a new way to get their hands on those exotic Indian spices like pepper and cinnamon, which were more valuable than gold at the time. Seriously, a pound of pepper was worth more than a pretty penny, try 20 pennies. Enter the navigational prowess, or lack thereof, of the 15th century. Sure, they had maps, but calling them accurate would be like calling a treasure map reliable. Their ships were sturdy enough to handle the Atlantic, but relied on the stars for direction, which worked great unless it was cloudy. Yet, the Portuguese were determined, partly because King John Roman II had dreams of a maritime empire that would make the Roman Empire look like a neighborhood watch. Vasco, growing up in this environment, learned the ropes of navigation and military strategy, thanks to his father's connections. By the time he was in his 20s, Vasco was already making a name for himself as a savvy navigator and a bold sailor. He caught the eye of King Manuel I, who had taken the throne in 1495 and had grand plans for expanding Portugal's influence. King Manuel was like a kid with a globe and a bucket list, and he needed someone audacious enough to turn those dreams into reality. Now, why Vasco? Why not some other salt-crusted sailor with a death wish? Here's where the politics gets as juicy as a medieval scandal. King Manuel's choice was partly due to Vasco's proven loyalty to the crown, and partly because his father had previously been entrusted with the command of an expedition to India, an expedition that never happened due to reasons as murky as the Atlantic on a stormy night. There was also the fact that Vasco had a reputation for being a no-nonsense kind of guy, the sort you trust to deliver a message without adding emojis. The stakes were high, and the economic pressures were mounting. The Portuguese crown was spending money like it was going out of style, and they needed a return on their investment. The plan was simple: find a sea route to India, bypassing the pesky Ottomans and their toll booths. But the reality was far from simple. The journey would be perilous, long, and filled with enough uncertainty to give even the hardiest sailor a pause. Technologically, the Portuguese were working with ships known as carracks and caravels, sturdy vessels that were the equivalent of the 15th century SUV, capable but not exactly luxury liners. The navigational tools, compasses and astrolabes, rudimentary by today's GPS standards, often led to more guesswork than certainty. Yet, despite these limitations, Vasco was tasked with the monumental job of charting a course to India, a task that had eluded many before him. As Vasco prepared for what would become his legendary voyage, he was well aware of the dangers that lay ahead. But the potential rewards were too tempting to ignore: a direct trade route to the riches of the East, a chance to cement his legacy, and the opportunity to make Portugal a maritime powerhouse. It was a gamble, but one that promised glory, riches, and a place in the history books that wouldn't be just a footnote. With the blessings of King Manuel, a fleet of 4 ships, and a crew of about 170 men, Vasco da Gama set out in July 1497, ready to take on the unknown. He may not have known it then, but he was about to change the course of history forever. And so, with sails billowing like oversized petticoats in the wind, Vasco da Gama and his merry band of adventurers set off from Lisbon in July 1497, their eyes set on a prize that was both elusive and spicy. The fleet, consisting of the São Gabriel, São Rafael Berrio, and a supply ship aptly named the Store Ship, was a veritable floating circus of hopes, dreams, and a touch of impending scurvy. Now, let's not romanticize this too much. Sure, setting sail into the unknown sounds like the kind of thing that would make for a killer Instagram post today. But back then, it was more akin to signing up for a reality show without knowing the plot twists. The open sea was as unpredictable as a teenager's mood swings. There were storms that could toss ships around like bathtub toys, and the dreaded doldrums, those windless stretches of ocean that left sailors with nothing to do but twiddle their thumbs and question their life choices. The journey down the coast of Africa was less smooth sailing and more dodging disaster. It took them until November to reach the Cape of Good Hope, a name that suggested optimism, but really it was a sailor's euphemism for good luck surviving this one. Navigating this treacherous point was like trying to thread a needle during an earthquake. Yet, Vasco and his crew managed it, though not without a few navigation hiccups along the way. When your GPS is the night sky, it's easy to find yourself off course, or worse, heading towards that mysterious edge of the world that everyone feared. And then there was the minor issue of scurvy, the sailor's nightmare. A lack of vitamin C turned gums to mush and limbs to jelly. Picture a crew of men in their prime, reduced to a state that made walking across the deck a Herculean task. By the time they reached the modern-day Mozambique, they were as eager for fresh fruit as a kid is for candy. The locals must have been baffled by these Europeans, with their teeth falling out and their over-reliance on hardtack, a delightful meal that was essentially rock-hard bread that could double as a weapon. Morale was another challenge. Keeping a crew happy on a months-long voyage was like trying to keep a cat entertained with the same toy for hours. It required a mix of camaraderie, discipline, and the occasional ration of grog. Vasco, with his no-nonsense reputation, was the kind of captain who could inspire confidence and fear in equal measure. But even he had to contend with the bizarre superstitions that sailors clung to like lifeboats in a storm. Whistling on board was a big no-no unless you wanted to summon a storm. And heaven forbid you mention a rabbit, bad luck on the high seas. Despite these challenges, there were moments that bordered on the comedic. Take, for example, the time they mistook the coastline of southern Africa for India. The crew was ready to celebrate, perhaps a little too eager to claim victory and return home as heroes. But Vasco, ever the skeptic, wasn't convinced by the palm trees and warm climate. A few awkward conversations with the locals, who were definitely not Indian, confirmed his suspicions. As they continued up the eastern coast of Africa, they encountered the bustling port city of Mombasa. Here, the crew experienced a cultural exchange that was less "come-bear" and more "what are you doing here?" The locals were not exactly thrilled to see strange ships looming on the horizon, and tensions ran high. It was a stark reminder that Vasco's journey was not just about battling the elements, but also navigating the complex web of politics and trade that already existed in the Indian Ocean. Eventually, after what seemed like an eternity at sea, they reached Malindi, where the local ruler was more welcoming. It was here they met a man who would become their navigational savior, a pilot named Ahmad ibn Majid. With his help, they finally set a course for India, crossing the Arabian Sea in a journey that felt like a miracle of navigation. Imagine plotting a course across an ocean with nothing but the wind and stars, and you'll appreciate the feat. The crew arrived in Calicut, India, in May 1498, nearly a year after they first set sail. The journey had been a test of endurance, wit, and sheer stubbornness. Vasco da Gama had done what many thought impossible, but the reality of their arrival was far from the romanticized glory they might have imagined. The locals, accustomed to traders from across the Indian Ocean, were less impressed by these bedraggled Europeans than the Portuguese had hoped. They didn't roll out a red carpet, but rather a series of negotiations, misunderstandings, and economic realities that would shape the future of Portuguese-Indian relations. This was no simple case of mission accomplished. Vasco and his crew faced a new world of diplomacy, trade bargaining, and the realization that their knowledge of the East was, well, lacking. But that's a story for another time. For now, the journey was only halfway over, and the return trip promised its own set of challenges. Stay tuned as we dive into the ongoing saga of Vasco da Gama's quest for spice, glory, and a little bit of sanity. And so, Vasco da Gama and his weary crew found themselves on the shores of India, their arrival more akin to stumbling into a party they weren't invited to than a triumphant parade. The date was May 20, 1498, and as they set foot in Calicut, the air was thick with the scent of spices, salt, and a hint of skepticism. The locals, who had seen their fair share of traders from the Arab world, China, and beyond, regarded these strange men with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. To them, the Portuguese were just another set of merchants in a long line of seafaring salesmen. Now, let's tackle the myth that Vasco was greeted like a rock star. In reality, the reception was more lukewarm than fever-pitched. The Zamorin of Calicut, the local ruler, didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. Instead, he offered a courteous but cautious welcome, intrigued by these new potential trading partners, yet wary of their intentions. Vasco, on the other hand, had come with the expectation of instant fame and fortune, but he quickly learned that the spice trade was no simple bazaar transaction. It was a complex web of established relationships and cutthroat negotiations, more Game of Thrones than Arabian Nights. The Portuguese, armed with their best trinkets and textiles, were ready to barter, but their offerings, cloaks, hats, and coral beads, were about as appealing to the seasoned Indian merchants as a snow shovel in the Sahara. The locals, accustomed to high-quality goods like silk and precious metals, were not impressed. It was a case of trading faux pas that left Da Gama and his men scratching their heads and rethinking their strategy. Imagine trying to trade a plastic bracelet for a Rolex, and you'll get the picture. Economically, the stakes were high for Vasco and his crew. They were under pressure to return with spices that would justify the costs and risks of their journey. The Portuguese crown had invested heavily in this expedition, and the expectation was clear. Bring back enough pepper and cinnamon to make the venture profitable. But the initial trading attempts were as awkward as a first date with no chemistry. The Zamorin, used to dealing with the seasoned traders of the Indian Ocean, saw little reason to disrupt existing trade networks for a few baubles and European goods. The misunderstandings didn't end at commerce. Cultural exchanges were peppered with miscommunication, quite literally. The Portuguese, unfamiliar with Indian customs, found themselves navigating a social landscape as foreign as the Indian Ocean was to their ships. There were instances where their lack of knowledge led to unintended faux pas. For example, they initially struggled with the local practice of commerce, which relied heavily on trust and long-standing relationships, rather than the immediate cash exchanges they were used to in Europe. As for the Portuguese, they were also grappling with the geopolitical complexities of the region. Calicut was a hub of the Indian Ocean trade, a melting pot of cultures, languages, and religions. The region was not just economically significant, but also politically complex, with a network of alliances and rivalries that Vasco had to navigate. The Zamorin himself was a powerful figure, ruling over a prosperous territory with a keen eye on maintaining his dominance in the spice trade. He was no pushover, and Vasco quickly realized that securing a favorable trade deal was going to be more challenging than anticipated. Now, about those myths. The legend of Vasco's journey often glosses over the gritty realities. It paints a picture of seamless cultural exchange and instant success. But the truth was far messier. Vasco's crew, for all their bravado, were out of their depth in this new world. They had to contend with language barriers, cultural differences, and a trade system that was far more sophisticated than they had anticipated. The romantic notion of a European hero conquering the markets of the East with charm and charisma is just that, a notion. The real story was one of trial and error, a steep learning curve that would ultimately lay the groundwork for future Portuguese endeavors in the region. Despite the initial setbacks, Vasco's presence in Calicut had significant economic implications. It marked the beginning of a new era of trade between Europe and the East, one that would eventually lead to the establishment of a Portuguese trading empire in the Indian Ocean. The arrival of the Portuguese signaled a shift in the balance of power, a move that would have profound consequences not only for the local rulers, but also for the global spice trade. The journey back to Portugal was another saga of endurance and navigation, but the foundations had been laid. Vasco da Gama's expedition, despite its rocky start, had opened the door to a new world of economic opportunity for Portugal. It was a first step in what would become a long and complicated relationship between Europe and India, a relationship that would be marked by both collaboration and conflict. The economic implications for Portugal were immense. The direct sea route to India promised to bypass the middlemen who had long controlled the spice trade, potentially lowering costs and increasing profits. Portuguese crown, eager to capitalize on this newfound access, saw the potential for immense wealth and power. But it wasn't just about spices. The encounter with India introduced Europe to new textiles, dyes, and other goods that would eventually become staples in European markets. And so, as Vasco and his crew prepared to leave Calicut, they carried with them not just spices and stories, but the seeds of an economic revolution. The journey was far from over, and the next chapters in this tale would be filled with new challenges, opportunities, and of course, more than a few misadventures. But for now, the Portuguese had a foothold in India, and the world of trade was about to change in ways no one could have foreseen. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the story of Vasco da Gama and the ever-evolving dance of exploration, commerce, and cultural exchange. And just like that, Vasco da Gama and his crew set sail again, heading back to Portugal with their precious cargo of spices and stories that would make for some legendary after-dinner anecdotes. But if you thought the journey to India was a roller coaster, the return trip was the kind of sequel that makes you wonder why anyone thought it was a good idea in the first place. First off, let's talk about the logistics. The return voyage began in August 1498, and it was anything but smooth sailing. Remember, this was the era before weather apps and radar, so when I say they were sailing blind, I mean it almost literally. The Indian Ocean, in all its unpredictable glory, threw everything it had at them: monsoons, treacherous winds, and the kind of waves that make you rethink your life choices. By the time they reached Malindi again, their spirits were as battered as their ships. They'd left a few crew members behind in Calicut, victims of scurvy and the harsh realities of long sea voyages. Those who remained were eager to get back to their European comforts, or at least to a place where they didn't have to eat another hardtack biscuit. Malindi was a brief respite, a pit stop for supplies, and a chance to swap stories with the locals who, by now, were probably just as curious about these Europeans as they were wary. After restocking, the fleet pushed on towards the Cape of Good Hope, which, as we've established, is a bit of a misnomer when you're facing its infamous storms. Navigating this treacherous point was no picnic. It was more like trying to dance the tango on a tightrope. By the time they rounded the Cape, they'd lost another ship, the São Rafael, scuttled to save the rest of the fleet. It was a bitter but necessary choice, kind of like choosing which bills to pay first when you're short on cash. And speaking of cash, let's not forget the economic pressures that weighed heavily on Vasco's mind. The spices they were carrying, pepper, cinnamon, and ginger, were like gold dust. Back in Europe, these were commodities that could make or break fortunes, and there was no shortage of eager merchants waiting to get their hands on them. But the pressure was on to deliver not just spices, but also a viable trade route that could bypass the Ottomans and their hefty tolls. It was the 15th century equivalent of cutting out the middleman, and everyone was banking on it. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity at sea, the fleet limped back into Lisbon in July 1499, almost 2 years after their departure. You'd think they'd be greeted like conquering heroes, but the reception was more "welcome back. Now what have you done for us lately?" than a ticker-tape parade. Sure, there were celebrations, but beneath the surface lay a simmering tension. King Manuel I, who had been anxiously awaiting their return, was thrilled with the cargo, but not so much with the tales of hardship and the less-than-stellar trading success. The economic reality was that while the spices were valuable, the expedition hadn't exactly been the financial windfall everyone had hoped for. The costs of the journey were astronomical. and the promise of future profit was still just that, a promise. Politically, Vasco's return had stirred the pot. Suddenly, every noble with a ship and a crew wanted in on the action, eager to carve out their own slice of the spice trade pie. But this wasn't just about economics, it was about power. Control of the sea route to India meant a shift in the balance of power within Europe. It was like being handed the keys to the kingdom, and everyone wanted a turn at the wheel. And let's not forget the human cost. Vasco's voyage had seen a staggering loss of life. Only 54 of the original 170 men returned. Disease, malnutrition, and the harsh conditions of sea travel had taken their toll. These weren't just numbers. These were men with families, dreams, and lives that ended far too soon. It's a somber reminder that the age of exploration, for all its glory, was also an age of sacrifice. Then there's Vasco himself. He returned to Portugal not just as a seasoned sailor, but as a man who'd faced the edge of the known world and lived to tell the tale. But with fame came scrutiny. There were whispers, too, the kind of malicious gossip that inevitably follows anyone who achieves something extraordinary. Critics pointed out the missteps, the failures, the human cost. It was a classic case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Despite this, Vasco da Gama was rewarded for his efforts. He was granted the title of Admiral of the Seas of Arabia, Persia, India, and all the Orient. It was a mouthful, sure, but it was also a testament to his achievement. King Manuel also showered him with riches, ensuring that Vasco wouldn't have to worry about where his next meal was coming from ever again. But with great power comes great responsibility, or in Vasco's case, a lifetime of political maneuvering and further voyages to secure Portugal's hold on the newly discovered trade routes. The impact of Vasco's voyage went beyond economics and politics. It was cultural, too. His journey marked the beginning of a new era of global interaction. It was the first crack in a door that would eventually swing wide open, leading to centuries of European involvement in the East. This was the dawn of globalization, with all its promise and peril. Yet, for all the romantic notions of exploration, the reality was much harsher. The Portuguese presence in India would become a complicated legacy of trade, conquest, and colonization. Vasco's journey was a catalyst for change, but it also set the stage for conflicts that would resonate for centuries. The myths of exploration often gloss over the darker aspects, the exploitation, the cultural clashes, the imposition of foreign rule. So, as Vasco settled back into life in Portugal, he did so with the knowledge that his voyage was both a triumph and a cautionary tale. It was a story of human endurance and ambition, of the relentless pursuit of wealth and power, and of the unforeseen consequences that come with charting a course into the unknown. The journey was over, but the story was far from finished. There were new horizons to explore, new challenges to face, and a world that was, for better or worse, forever changed. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the saga of Vasco da Gama and the intricate dance of exploration, commerce, and the ever-evolving web of global history. There's more to come, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. As the age of exploration unfolded like an epic saga, Vasco da Gama's journey was both a prologue and a catalyst, a story that signaled a seismic shift in global dynamics. This was no longer just a tale of one man and his ships braving uncharted waters. It was the opening act of European colonial ambitions that would ripple across continents and centuries. Vasco's voyages drew a new map for the world, one that would be etched with the ambitions, greed, and inevitable conflicts of empires. Let's not kid ourselves. The legacy of Vasco's expeditions was as complex as a medieval tapestry, woven with threads of commerce, conquest, and calamity. His success in opening the sea route to India was akin to discovering the cheat code to global trade. By bypassing the land routes controlled by the Ottomans, Portugal had essentially hacked the Silk Road, redirecting the flow of wealth and power. The result? Lisbon transformed into a bustling hub of commerce, its ports brimming with the spices and silks that had once seemed as elusive as a unicorn. And here's where the economic context gets juicy. Portuguese crown, flush with the riches of the East, was eager to capitalize on its newfound access. The cost of spices plummeted in Europe, disrupting the market dynamics like a bull in a china shop. Pepper, that once coveted luxury, became a staple instead of a status symbol. It's as if saffron suddenly popped up in every pantry. The profits were staggering, but they came with a side of geopolitical tension. As Portugal's coffers filled, rival nations watched with envy, their ambitions stoked by the scent of cinnamon and cloves. Yet Vasco's legacy wasn't just about trade winds and treasure chests. His voyages ignited the tinder of European colonialism, setting off a chain reaction that would shape the course of history. The Portuguese, buoyed by their success, began carving out a maritime empire, staking claims along the Indian Ocean's rim like a board game gone global. From Goa to Malacca, their fortresses sprouted like mushrooms after a rainstorm, each one a testament to Portugal's burgeoning influence and its appetite for domination. But let's take a reality check here. The romanticized image of explorers as noble adventurers belies the harsher truths of their endeavors. Vasco's expeditions laid the groundwork for a system of exploitation and oppression that would cast long shadows. The Portuguese crown, in its quest for profit, turned a blind eye to the costs borne by those they subjugated. Indigenous populations were caught in the colonial crossfire, their societies upended by the arrival of these foreign powers. Take Goa, for instance, a jewel in the Portuguese crown, but a thorn in the side of its inhabitants. The establishment of Portuguese rule brought with it a mix of cultural exchange and cultural erasure. The legacy of Vasco's voyages was a double-edged sword, offering the allure of new opportunities while wielding the weight of imperial ambitions. The spice trade was no longer just about flavor. It had become a battleground for control, with human lives often paying the price. And what of Vasco himself, the man behind the myth? History remembers him as a pioneering navigator, but the real Vasco was a study in contradictions. He was a hero to some, a villain to others, and a complex figure caught in the tides of his time. His voyages were a testament to human ingenuity and endurance, yet they were also a reminder of the darker impulses that drive exploration, the desire for power, for wealth, for legacy. Vasco's story is a microcosm of the larger narrative of the age of exploration, where glory and greed danced hand in hand. It's a tale that challenges us to look beyond the gilded pages of history books and confront the realities beneath. For every triumphant discovery, there were untold stories of struggle and strife. The legacy of exploration is one of both wonder and woe, a reminder that the paths we forge can lead to both enlightenment and exploitation. Fast forward to today, and we find ourselves in a world still grappling with the echoes of Vasco's voyages. The global trade networks he helped establish have grown into a web so intricate that it's hard to imagine a time before them. We live in a world where cultures collide and coalesce, where the exchange of goods and ideas is as constant as the tides. Yet, the lessons of history remain ever relevant, urging us to navigate the complexities of our interconnected world with an eye towards equity and empathy. As we wrap up this saga, let's indulge in a bit of reflective humor. Vasco da Gama might have been the rock star explorer of his day, but even he couldn't have predicted the dizzying dance of globalization that would follow in his wake. In the end, history remembers its heroes with a mix of reverence and realism. We celebrate their achievements while acknowledging the shadows they cast, a reminder that progress is often a paradox, a blend of light and dark, of triumph and tragedy. So here's to Vasco da Gama, a man who set out to find a new world, and in doing so, changed our own. His story is a testament to the enduring spirit of exploration and the ever-evolving narrative of human history. And as we sail into the future, let's carry with us the lessons of the past, steering a course towards a world that's just a little bit wiser for all the journeys we've taken. And with that, our voyage through history draws to a close. But fear not, fellow travelers. There are always new stories to uncover, new chapters to explore. So keep your curiosity as boundless as the seas Vasco once traversed, and who knows what adventures await on the horizon. Until next time, fair winds and following seas to all who dare to dream beyond the shores. The life of a medieval alchemist wasn't exactly the stuff of fairy tales, despite what those dusty old manuscripts might have you believe. Instead of mystically waving your hands and mumbling Latin incantations, you'd likely spend your days hunched over a rickety wooden table in a dimly lit workshop, squinting at bubbling beakers, while praying you don't accidentally transform yourself into a human fireball. Spoiler alert. Alchemy was risky business, and not just because of the volatile chemicals involved. Financially, it was a nightmare on par with modern student loans. Let's talk coin first, because that's where the real alchemy starts, turning your money into wishful thinking. Sourcing materials like mercury and lead wasn't just a matter of popping down to the medieval equivalent of a Home Depot. Mercury, for instance, often came from Spain or the far-off mines of Slovenia, making it a pricey import. And lead, while more common, still demanded a chunk of your savings. Imagine shelling out a significant portion of your earnings just to buy materials that could poison you. That's like paying premium prices for a subscription to chronic illness monthly. Now, you might think, hey, weren't alchemists just the wizards of their time? Not quite. While the image of a mystical sage with a long beard and a knack for arcane secrets sounds appealing, the reality was more Walter White than Gandalf. Your typical alchemist was a scientist, albeit one who hadn't quite nailed the whole scientific method thing. You'd be experimenting with various compounds, attempting to unlock the secrets of the universe, but mostly just unlocking new ways to get third-degree burns. And your lab. Picture a cramped room, with barely enough light to see what you're doing, let alone to read any of those mysterious tomes stacked around you. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty of medieval economics for a moment. In those days, the cost of living could be crippling, especially if you were in the business of chasing the elusive philosopher's stone. A skilled craftsman might earn a few pennies a day, but an alchemist needed to fork out considerably more for tools and materials. The costs could soar into the pounds. Yes, pounds, not pennies, if you were particularly ambitious in your quest for transmutation. That's a hefty sum when you consider that a pound could buy you a decent horse or a small plot of land. Alchemy, in short, was a financial black hole. Let's not forget the political and social factors in play. Many alchemists relied on the patronage of wealthy nobles or even royalty, who were eager for any edge in the endless game of power and prestige. But this support came with strings attached, namely the expectation of results. If you didn't deliver the goods, say, a glimmer of gold or a cure for whatever ailed your patron, you could find yourself out of favor faster than you could say transmutation. And in some cases, failing to please your patron could have more dire consequences than just losing your funding. But why, you might wonder, did anyone pursue alchemy at all? Well, despite the hardships, the allure of the philosopher's stone was powerful. The promise of turning base metals into gold, of achieving eternal life, was a siren song that lured many a hopeful soul. It was the medieval equivalent of a get-rich-quick scheme, except with more explosions and a higher likelihood of contracting lead poisoning. And let's be honest, who wouldn't be tempted by the idea of sipping from the fountain of youth or rolling in a pile of gold coins? Yet, most alchemists didn't even come close to realizing these dreams. Instead, found themselves grappling with the hard realities of their time, limited scientific knowledge, a lack of reliable equipment, and a society that often viewed their work with suspicion. It was a world where the line between science and mysticism was as blurry as a potion gone wrong. And while the myths of alchemy endure, painting a picture of wise sages and magical transformations, the truth is that being an alchemist was a lot more about grit and a lot less about glamour. In the end, life of a medieval alchemist was a balancing act between ambition and reality, between dreams of gold and the harsh truths of lead. It was a pursuit fraught with danger and disappointment, but driven by the same curiosity and desire for discovery that fuels science today. So the next time you hear the word alchemy, think less of Merlin and more of a scrappy entrepreneur, hustling against the odds, armed with little more than a few coins and a whole lot of hope. That's the real magic of alchemy, an unyielding quest for knowledge in a world that didn't always understand or appreciate it. But just when you thought alchemy was merely a quaint pastime for eccentric dreamers, we're diving into the heart of the medieval hustle, social status. That's right, alchemists weren't just science geeks with a penchant for explosions. They were also navigating a social minefield that could elevate them to the status of revered scholars, or drag them down as the medieval equivalent of a snake oil salesman. Let's start with the high-stakes game of patronage. Picture this. You're an alchemist with a potentially revolutionary idea, say, turning lead into gold or concocting the elixir of life. The problem: your medieval piggy bank is emptier than a monk's dating calendar. Enter the noble patron. These wealthy individuals, often of royal blood, were the venture capitalists of their time. bankrolling projects that promised prestige, power, or, let's not sugarcoat it, cold, hard cash. But securing a patron was a double-edged sword. Sure, it could mean a steady supply of funds and resources for your experiments, but it also meant constant pressure to deliver tangible results. Imagine being in the shoes, or rather the pointy medieval boots, of someone like John Dee. Dee was an English alchemist, mathematician, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. His reputation was that of a brilliant mind, but he was also burdened with the expectation of producing results that bordered on the miraculous to keep his royal patrons happy. And here's the kicker. Not delivering could have consequences more dire than a simple, "you're fired." In a world where failure was often seen as a sign of moral weakness or even deception, an unsuccessful alchemist could swiftly fall from grace. Take Edward Kelly, Dee's infamous associate. Kelly claimed to have the secret to making gold, a claim that initially earned him the patronage of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph Roman II. But when his promises failed to materialize, Kelly found himself imprisoned, and his career, not to mention his freedom, went up in smoke. The societal pressures on alchemists were enormous. They were walking a tightrope between being hailed as geniuses and being branded as frauds. The allure of alchemy was like a siren's call, promising fame and fortune, but one wrong step, and you could find yourself in a cell, or worse, at the business end of an angry mob's pitchfork. And while we're on the subject of angry mobs, let's talk about the constant threat of being labeled a fraud. Back in the day, the line between alchemy and deception was blurrier than a potion-induced hallucination. In the public eye, the work of alchemists was shrouded in mystery, and where there is mystery, suspicion follows. Alchemists had to be as skilled in public relations as they were in their experiments, always ready to dazzle with a bit of showmanship to keep the skeptics at bay. But let's not forget the potential rewards. Successfully transmuting a base metal into gold wasn't just a scientific breakthrough. It was a ticket to the big leagues. Being recognized as a legitimate alchemist could mean a lifetime of prestige and influence. The problem was, very few ever got there. Most ended up with little more than singed eyebrows and a pile of debt. Despite these challenges, the image of the alchemist as a wise sage endured, fueled by a mix of genuine achievements, clever marketing, and a society eager to believe in the possibility of miracles. The romantic notion of the alchemist as a mystical figure persisted, even as the reality was far grittier, a testament to the human penchant for hope over experience. So, where does this leave our medieval alchemist? In a precarious position, juggling the expectations of patrons, the suspicions of the public, and the ever-elusive quest for discovery. It's a tale as old as time, a blend of ambition, risk, and the relentless pursuit of impossible dreams. And as we continue our journey through the world of alchemy, remember that every experiment carried the weight of both opportunity and peril, a dance as delicate as any courtly intrigue. Stay tuned, because the alchemical adventure is just heating up, and there's plenty more to uncover in the bubbling cauldron of history. Let's switch gears from the social tightrope of medieval alchemy and dive head first into the chaotic world of the alchemist's laboratory. Now, brace yourself. This isn't your high school chemistry class with Bunsen burners and safety goggles. Nope, this is more like a medieval episode of Mythbusters. Except the myths are about magic stones, and the only thing busting is probably your lab equipment. First, let's talk about the so-called scientific methods of the time. Spoiler, they didn't really exist. If you're thinking of the orderly process of hypothesis, experiment, and conclusion, think again. In the alchemist's playbook, it was more like trial, error, and fiery explosion. The goal, to transform base metals like lead into gold or create the philosopher's stone, a mystical substance that could supposedly cure diseases and grant eternal life. Talk about ambitious. Imagine you're in a cramped, dimly lit room where the closest thing to quality control is praying you don't blow up. The tools at your disposal are rudimentary at best. We're talking about alembics, crucibles, and retorts, basically medieval lab glassware that looks like it's been designed by a committee of sadistic glassblowers. You'd use substances like mercury, sulfur, and salt in your experiments, and getting these materials wasn't a walk in the medieval park. Mercury, for instance, was a slippery, toxic metal that could easily sneak into your system and give you a free ticket to an early grave, complete with a side of madness. Now, let's touch on the methodology. or lack thereof. Alchemy was less about following a recipe and more about throwing ingredients into a pot and hoping for the best. Picture this. You're heating a mixture of lead and sulfur, convinced you're on the verge of creating gold. Instead, what you get is a cloud of toxic fumes and a nasty burn. Your neighbors are probably wondering if you're trying to summon a dragon. The line between success and disaster was thinner than a medieval monk's patience for heresy. Speaking of disasters, alchemical experiments were notorious for their explosive outcomes. It wasn't uncommon for a mishap to leave an alchemist with singed eyebrows, or worse, a whole new hole in the wall. Take the case of Johann Friedrich Bircher, a German alchemist who, while attempting to make gold, accidentally invented European porcelain. Sure, porcelain didn't make him rich, but it did save his neck from the executioner's axe. Turns out, kings love a good dinner set. The frustration of these failures was palpable. Imagine putting in hours, days, sometimes even years, only to end up with a mess of molten lead instead of a nugget of gold. And yet, despite the setbacks, alchemists persisted. Why? Because the potential rewards were astronomical. The promise of transmutation was like a medieval lottery ticket, albeit one that came with a significantly higher chance of personal injury. Now, you might be wondering, was there any science in this chaos? Surprisingly, yes. While alchemy was wrapped in mysticism, it laid the groundwork for modern chemistry. Alchemists were some of the first to experiment with distillation, sublimation, and fermentation, processes we still use today. The boundary between alchemy and early chemistry was hazy, but it was there, like a faint outline in a cloud of sulfuric smoke. Consider the likes of Robert Boyle, often hailed as the father of modern chemistry. Boyle was influenced by alchemical practices and even dabbled in the quest for the philosopher's stone. However, he approached his experiments with a more rigorous mindset, documenting his findings meticulously. His work eventually led to Boyle's law, which described the relationship between pressure and volume of a gas. A far cry from trying to turn lead into gold, but a testament to the transition from alchemy to chemistry. And let's not forget Isaac Newton, who spent more time on alchemy than on physics. Yes, the guy who defined gravity was also trying to conjure gold from lead. His alchemical notes, filled with cryptic symbols and secret codes, reveal an obsession with unlocking the universe's mysteries. Newton's alchemical pursuits might seem eccentric today, but they were part of a broader intellectual curiosity that fueled his scientific achievements. In the end, the alchemist's lab was a place of contradictions, an arena of both superstition and scientific discovery. It was a space where the mystical and the empirical collided, and where the pursuit of the impossible often led to the improbable. Alchemists may not have turned lead into gold, but they transformed the way we think about the natural world. As we wrap up this segment of our alchemical odyssey, remember that the journey from alchemy to chemistry was as much about the failures as it was about the triumphs. So next time you're stuck in traffic or waiting for your coffee to brew, spare a thought for those medieval alchemists. Armed with little more than ambition and a few hazardous substances, they dared to dream big, even if it meant the occasional singed eyebrow. Stay tuned, because the quest for knowledge continues, and our alchemical adventure is far from over. So here we are, dipping our toes into the murky waters of alchemy's philosophical and spiritual allure. You see, alchemy wasn't just about trying to turn lead into gold. It was also about turning the alchemist himself into something greater. It was part science, part mysticism, and a whole lot of existential herbal tea. Let's talk about the Emerald Tablet, one of the cornerstone texts of alchemical philosophy. Cloaked in mystery and attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a mythical fusion of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, this little text has the kind of reputation that makes the Da Vinci Code look like a library pamphlet. The entire tablet is only a few lines long, yet it promises to reveal the secrets of the universe. Kind of like tweeting, but with more gold metaphors and fewer hashtags. The Emerald Tablet's most famous line, "As above, so below," suggests a cosmic symmetry that alchemists found irresistible. To them, it meant that the microcosm of their experiments reflected the macrocosm of the universe. Imagine thinking that your bubbling cauldron of chemicals was somehow connected to the stars. It's like feeling a kinship with Elon Musk just because you're charging your phone. Now, if you were an alchemist, you weren't just after material transformation. You were after spiritual enlightenment. This was the medieval self-help industry in action. The philosopher's stone wasn't just about turning lead into gold. It was about turning the ordinary human into something extraordinary. It promised immortality and the perfection of the soul. Who wouldn't want that? It's like an eternal youth serum and a Nobel Peace Prize rolled into one. But here's the rub. While these lofty ideals sounded divine, the reality was often more like a medieval episode of kitchen nightmares. Alchemists were knee-deep in soot and sulfur, with the only transformation being their crisped eyebrows. The spiritual journey was less about transcendence and more about surviving another day without inhaling toxic fumes. Also, let's not forget the allure of secret knowledge. Alchemical texts were often written in cryptic language, like they were a medieval form of password protection. They used obscure symbols and allegories. Ever tried reading a recipe when the instructions are in hieroglyphics? That's what these texts were like. The secrecy wasn't just about protecting trade secrets. It was about creating an aura of esoteric wisdom. The more obscure your writings, the more people thought you were onto something big. It's like being the guy who knows a guy, but never quite reveals who the guy is. But the quest for secret knowledge had its dangers. The church, always on the lookout for heresy, was less than thrilled with activities that smacked of occultism. Alchemists had to tread carefully. In a time when the wrong kind of thinking could get you a one-way ticket to a heresy trial, they had to balance their quest for knowledge with the very real possibility of ending up on the wrong side of a church council. That didn't stop many from diving headfirst into the esoteric pool. Take Nicholas Flamel, a French scribe who became legendary for allegedly discovering the secret of the philosopher's stone. Whether he ever succeeded is up for debate, but his name became synonymous with alchemical success. Flamel's story was irresistible, a humble man who supposedly cracked the code of immortality. It's the medieval equivalent of a lottery win, with a touch of the supernatural. However, while Flamel's tale is steeped in legend, the everyday alchemist wasn't so lucky. Most found their spiritual journeys hindered by the grime and grit of daily life. Their labs were filled with more smoke than enlightenment, and the quest for spiritual perfection was often overshadowed by more mundane concerns, like paying the rent or not dying from mercury poisoning. These spiritual aspirations didn't exist in a vacuum, though. They were part of a broader intellectual movement that included astrology, magic, and religion. The lines between these disciplines were as blurry as a medieval map. Alchemists were often polymaths, dabbling in multiple fields in their quest to unlock the universe's secrets. It was a time when science and mysticism danced a complicated waltz, each step forward leaving a trail of both wonder and skepticism. The philosophical side of alchemy also played into the social dynamics of the time. Being an alchemist gave you an air of mystery and authority. It was like being the world's earliest influencer, with patrons and followers hanging on your every cryptic word. But that status came with a cost. Expectations were high, and skepticism was never far behind. So, what kept these alchemical dreamers going? Despite the soot and skepticism, the allure of alchemy's spiritual promise was powerful. It was a tantalizing mix of ambition and idealism. The idea that one could achieve not just material wealth, but also spiritual enlightenment was a siren song that many couldn't resist. In a world with limited scientific understanding, the mysterious and the miraculous were not just possible, they were tantalizingly within reach. In the end, the philosophical and spiritual side of alchemy was a double-edged sword. It offered hope and enlightenment, but it also demanded grit and resilience. Alchemists were seekers of truth, driven by the desire for transformation in a world that was often more lead than gold. As we continue our exploration of these medieval alchemists, remember that behind the myths and legends, there were real people, grappling with the weight of both the material and the metaphysical. And the story doesn't end here. Stay tuned, because we've only begun to unravel the tangled web of alchemical lore. There's more to discover in this world of bubbling cauldrons and cosmic mysteries, where the pursuit of knowledge was as much about the soul as it was about science. The journey continues, and there's plenty more magic and madness to uncover in the chapters ahead. And so, we find ourselves at the end of this alchemical odyssey, standing on the precipice of where ancient dreams meet modern realities. It's time to take stock of alchemy's mixed legacy, a legacy that's as confounding as it is captivating, much like trying to explain the plot of Inception to someone who's never seen it. Let's start with the elephant in the room, alchemy's contributions to modern science. Because, despite the singed eyebrows and the occasional explosion, alchemists weren't just medieval mad scientists fumbling in the dark. They were the unwitting architects of what we now call chemistry. The very notion of conducting experiments, observing results, and recording them, even if on parchment that's half singed, was an embryonic form of the scientific method. Alchemists were the original lab rats, running headlong into the unknown with nothing but curiosity and a healthy disregard for personal safety. Take, for instance, the process of distillation. Alchemists were distilling spirits long before it was cool, literally. The first known distillation of alcohol was documented in the 12th century by an Arab alchemist named Jabir ibn Hayyan, or Geber as he's known in the West. His work laid the groundwork for future advancements not just in chemistry, but in industries as varied as perfume and pharmaceuticals. Talk about a versatile legacy. Then we have the matter of acids and bases. Medieval alchemists were among the first to play with these corrosive substances, even if they weren't quite sure what they were doing. They documented the reactions of substances like vinegar and sulfuric acid, paving the way for future chemists to better understand chemical reactions. It's like they were the beta testers for the periodic table, minus the safety goggles and lab coats. And let's not forget metallurgy. While not every alchemist managed to turn lead into gold, spoiler, none did. They did advance the field of metallurgy, developing techniques for refining and alloying metals that are still used today. The quest for transmutation, while ultimately futile, drove innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with metalwork. So, while the philosopher's stone might have been a dud, the metallurgical advances were pure gold. Of course, we can't talk about alchemy without addressing the pop culture myths that have given it an undue aura of mysticism. From Harry Potter to Full Metal Alchemist, the image of the wise alchemist wielding magical powers endures. But let's be real. Most alchemists were more Walter White than Hogwarts professor. Their magic was a mix of trial and error chemistry and a dash of hope, not the stuff of fairy tales. Yet the myths persist, and there's something undeniably romantic about them. The idea of turning base metals into gold or achieving immortality speaks to our deepest desires for transformation and transcendence. It's the ultimate underdog story, and who doesn't love a good tale of ambition against the odds? But let's not forget that behind every romantic notion was a grim reality of poisonous chemicals and economic ruin. The truth is, alchemy was less about magical transformations and more about gritty, hands-on experimentation. So, why does alchemy still captivate us? Perhaps it's because it embodies that unyielding human spirit of curiosity, the same spirit that sent humans to the moon and probes to Mars. Alchemists may not have found the philosopher's stone, but they laid the groundwork for future scientific achievements. They dared to dream big, even when those dreams were shrouded in clouds of sulfuric smoke. In the grand tapestry of history, alchemy represents both the folly and the brilliance of human endeavor. It's a testament to our willingness to reach for the stars, even when we can barely see beyond the next experiment. Alchemy may have been a wild goose chase, but it set us on the path to understanding the natural world in ways medieval alchemists could only imagine. And here's where we find the ultimate irony. While alchemists sought to transform the physical world, it was their own discipline that underwent the greatest transformation. From the ashes of alchemy rose the phoenix of modern science, a legacy far more valuable than any gold they could have conjured. In closing, alchemy serves as a reminder that sometimes the journey is more important than the destination. It's a symbol of humanity's relentless quest for knowledge, a journey full of failures and false starts, but one that invariably leads us forward. As we bid farewell to our medieval alchemists, remember, while they didn't turn lead into gold, they turned the wheels of progress, setting the stage for the scientific revolutions to come. So the next time you hear about alchemy, think of it not as a relic of the past, but as a testament to the enduring power of curiosity and the human spirit. Who knew that a bunch of medieval dreamers with a penchant for explosions would leave such a lasting legacy? Indeed, alchemy might not have changed lead into gold, but it certainly changed the world. And isn't that the real magic? You're in the cobblestone maze of 18th century London, where stepping into the street is like playing a game of dodge the chamber part. Yes, The morning bustle here isn't just about dodging carriages, but also avoiding yesterday's refuse being hurled out windows. Welcome to a world where a whiff of fresh air is as rare as a day without rain. But don't let the grime fool you. This city is buzzing with ideas, and you're about to dive into the cerebral beating heart of it all, the coffee house. It's around 1650, and the coffee houses have exploded onto the scene like a trendy new app. By 1700, there were over 550 coffee houses in London alone. That's one for every 500 citizens. And why not? For a penny, you could sip on a cup of this exotic brew and nab yourself a prime spot in the intellectual arena. If you're wondering, a penny back then is roughly equivalent to about $5 today, depending on the economic historian you ask. Still, a bargain if you consider what you're getting. These spots weren't just caffeine dens. They were the original think tanks. Dubbed penny universities, they offered a smorgasbord of intellectual stimulation for the price of a small coin. Forget formal education. Here, you could rub shoulders with merchants plotting their next trade, politicians debating policy, or philosophers pondering life's big questions. The democratic spirit of the coffee house was intoxicating, much like the beverages they served. All you needed was a penny and a thirst for conversation. Now, let me paint you a picture of these establishments. Far from the cozy cafes we're used to, these joints were more like the buzzing stock exchange floor, filled with chatter and the clatter of cups. And the coffee. Let's just say Starbucks' most bitter brew would probably taste like a vanilla latte in comparison. But it wasn't about the flavor. It was about the brew's magical ability to sharpen the senses and fuel the conversation. It was the internet of the age of enlightenment, a place where information flowed freely, unencumbered by class or status. These coffee houses were the antithesis of the ale houses, which, as you might guess, were the more boisterous, liquor-fueled counterparts. The ale house was where you went to forget your troubles, but the coffee house was where you went to tackle them head-on. If you were a merchant, you'd be here getting the latest news on trade winds or commodity prices. Politicians and pamphleteers would be scribbling furiously, debating the issues of the day. Spies, of course, were also lurking, eavesdropping on the chatter, because we're better to gather intel than a place where everyone had something to say. And speaking of saying, the coffee house was also a hotbed for the printed word. The penny you spent on a cup of coffee also got you access to the newspapers. These weren't the glossy tabloids of today, but they were packed with the kind of information that could make or break fortunes. Imagine the thrill of reading about a ship's arrival from the West Indies, laden with sugar, coffee's perfect sidekick, or the latest parliamentary scandal, which was always good for a heated debate. The allure of the coffee house wasn't just the news, it was the chance to be part of something bigger, to be in the know. It was about being able to drop a name or a fact into conversation and suddenly be the most interesting person in the room. Everyone, from the lowly apprentice to the high-born aristocrat, could find common ground over a steaming cup of coffee. It was a place where wit was the currency, and everyone was eager to spend it. But let's take a step back and question the romanticism of it all. These were, after all, public spaces in a city where sanitation was more of an aspiration than a reality. The air was thick with smoke from the fire, and the clientele wasn't always the genteel crowd you might expect. The coffee was often mixed with a bit more than just milk and sugar. Think additives to stretch the supply, and hygiene standards were, shall we say, a little loose. Yet, despite these gritty details, there was an undeniable charm to the chaos. It was messy, loud, and chaotic, but it was also where the pulse of the city could be felt most keenly. So why wouldn't you last a day here? Well, if you're used to your coffee with a side of Wi-Fi in a quiet corner, this might come as a cultural shock. The sensory overload is real, and the pace is relentless. The debates are fierce, and if you're not quick with your wit, you might find yourself left out of the conversation. Plus, let's not forget the smoke you might leave smelling like a bonfire with a side of burnt toast. But for those who thrived here, London's coffee houses were a stage where the mundane transformed into the extraordinary. In this world, every day was a chance to learn something new, to engage with someone unexpected, and to leave with your mind buzzing as much as your body. It wasn't just about coffee. It was about connection, conversation, and the exchange of ideas that could change the world, and often did. In the 18th century, the coffee house was more than a place. It was a movement, and whether or not you'd survive a day in their midst, there's no denying their impact on the tapestry of history. So, you've stepped inside this 18th century coffee house, and it's like walking into a live-action version of a social media feed. Loud, chaotic, and buzzing with opinions. Forget the serene ambience of your local cafe. This place is as far from Hig as you can get. The air is thick, and I'm not just talking about the tobacco smoke, which hangs like a stubborn fog. It's the noise level that really gets you. Imagine a room filled with the sound of 1,000 conversations, each trying to outdo the other. It's like a marketplace of ideas, with everyone hawking their intellectual wares at full volume. If you're the type who needs silence to think, you're in for a rude awakening. And let's talk about the seating arrangements, or lack thereof. You won't find any cozy nooks or plush sofas here. Instead, picture long communal tables, the kind you'd see at a medieval banquet, minus the turkey legs and goblets of mead. It's all benches and stools, and space is at such a premium that personal boundaries are more of a suggestion than a rule. You might find yourself wedged between a philosopher on your left, gesticulating wildly as he argues about the nature of existence, and a merchant on your right, feverishly calculating his next big trade. Privacy, forget it. You're here to share space, ideas, and probably a fair amount of sweat. Now, let's address the elephant, or rather, the lack of air conditioning, in the room. When the summer heat rolls in, you could roast a chicken in here. The combination of body heat, smoke, and hot coffee creates an atmosphere that's more sauna than salon. And in winter, well, let's just say a drafty room filled with damp wool coats isn't exactly cozy. Yet, people flock to these places, drawn by the magnetism of conversation and the possibility of rubbing shoulders with the next Newton or Lark. The discomfort was a small price to pay for a seat at the table of ideas. But here's the thing. As much as these coffee houses were egalitarian in spirit, they weren't exactly the bastions of inclusivity we might imagine. Women were often excluded from these intellectual bastions, left to ponder philosophical queries from afar, or more likely, from the confines of their homes. Sure, there were some exceptions, but for the most part, coffee houses were a boys' club, with all the exclusivity and machismo that implies. The social rules were unwritten but strictly enforced. Men only, unless you were serving the coffee. And speaking of social rules, the etiquette of these places was as complex as an 18th century courtship. You couldn't just waltz in, plop down, and start a conversation about the latest scandal in Parliament. No, there was a rhythm to things, a dance of words and wit that required finesse. You had to earn your place in the conversation, often through sharp dialogue or a well-timed quip. It was like a verbal fencing match, and woe betide the person who couldn't keep up. This was a place where words mattered, where reputation was built on the ability to argue, debate, and occasionally eviscerate with language. Of course, this brings us to the infamous coffee house gossip culture. If you thought today's tabloids were brutal, you haven't seen anything yet. Coffee houses were the epicenters of rumor and hearsay, where reputations could be made or destroyed over a single cup. Often, the stories were as fantastical as they were dubious, with rumors spreading like wildfire through the city. It was the 18th century version of going viral, and everyone was a potential influencer or victim. One day you might be the talk of the town, the next, the subject of public ridicule. It was a high-stakes game where everyone played, whether they liked it or not. But let's not forget the charm amidst the chaos. Yes, it was messy, and yes, it was loud, but it was also a place of incredible energy and creativity. It was where the boundaries of class and status blurred, at least for a moment, and where ideas could take flight. In an era where social mobility was often a distant dream, the coffee house represented a rare opportunity, a place where a sharp mind and quick wit could open doors. It was a marketplace of ideas, a crucible of thought, and for those who could handle the heat, it was exhilarating. So, would you last a day in an 18th century coffee house? Maybe not without a few grumbles about the lack of creature comforts, but if you could overlook the discomfort, you'd find yourself in the heart of the intellectual world, surrounded by the chatter of minds hungry for knowledge and debate. It's a place where ideas were born, where revolutions started with a whisper over a cup of bitter brew. And while the reality was far from the romanticized image we might hold today, there's no denying the impact these noisy, smoky, crowded rooms had on the world. It was the internet of its time, a place where information was the currency, and everyone was eager to spend it. So, as you take in the clamor and chaos of an 18th century coffee house, let's talk business. These places weren't just about intellectual sparring and philosophical musings. They were the incubators of modern capitalism, if you squint a little. Forget the New York Stock Exchange or the Chicago Board of Trade. London's coffee houses were the original trading floors. Here, deals were struck over steaming cups of the world's second favorite beverage after water. For the price of a penny, you could buy more than coffee. You could purchase a stake in the future. Picture this, Lloyd's Coffee House. It's 1688, and this little establishment is about to become the epicenter of maritime insurance. Edward Lloyd, the man with the name on the door, serves more than just coffee. His place becomes a hub for ship owners, merchants, and underwriters. It was the Silicon Valley of the high seas, a place where fortunes could be made, or sunk, on the rise and fall of the ocean's tides. Lloyd's became synonymous with maritime insurance, evolving into the Lloyd's of London we know today. This was the dot-com boom of its day, only with the added risk of shipwrecks and pirates. Lloyd's wasn't alone in this entrepreneurial frenzy. Jonathan's Coffee House, founded in 1680, was another hotspot, eventually morphing into the London Stock Exchange by the early 1800s. Here, traders swapped stocks like they were playing a high-stakes game of poker, each card a share in a company, each play a calculated risk. The buzz was electric, the atmosphere charged with the possibility of wealth beyond imagining or ruin beyond repair. And all this unfolded not in sterile offices, but in smoke-filled rooms where the clinking of coins was as frequent as the clatter of coffee cups. But let's not get too romantic. The risks were real, the stakes high. This was a time when the term limited liability was as foreign as a latte macchiato. You didn't just lose your shirt. You could lose your entire wardrobe and the house it was stored in. And yet, the allure of those coffee house deals was irresistible. They offered a democratization of enterprise, at least for the men who were allowed through the doors. Here, a savvy merchant could find himself rubbing shoulders, literally, given the cramped conditions, with the financial elite. It was a place where social mobility was brewed alongside your morning cup. And speaking of deals, let's not forget the pamphlets. Oh, the pamphlets. These little booklets were the tweets of their day, compact information bombs that could sway public opinion or ruin reputations before you could say French roast. Merchant guilds, political factions, and entrepreneurial upstarts all used these paper missiles to promote their interests and smear their rivals. In a world without instant messaging, these pamphlets were the next best thing, and the coffee house was their distribution hub. Now, let's talk numbers. By the early 18th century, more than 80% of Londoners were literate, a staggering statistic for the time. This unprecedented access to information fueled the coffee house economy, turning these establishments into data centers of their day. Imagine the power of being one of the first to hear about a new trade route or a political upheaval overseas. In a volatile world, information was as valuable as gold or coffee beans. And let's be honest, gossip was probably worth the price of admission alone. But while these coffee houses were buzzing with opportunity, they were also a minefield of misinformation, a sort of analog version of today's fake news. In a city where newspapers were still finding their footing, a rumor overheard in a coffee house could send markets into a tailspin or spark a panic. It was the perfect breeding ground for speculation, both financial and otherwise. And for those who thrived on chaos, it was a veritable playground. Yet despite the risks, or perhaps because of them, these coffee houses were critical to London's economic boom. They fostered a culture of innovation and speculation, laying the groundwork for the capitalist systems we recognize today. They were the blueprint for modern financial institutions, showing us that sometimes the best ideas start over a cup of coffee, amidst the smoke, noise, and chaos of a crowded room. Now, you might wonder how something as simple as a coffee house could wield such influence. The answer lies in the social alchemy they created. By bringing together diverse groups of people, traders, thinkers, and risk-takers, they became melting pots of ideas and opportunities. They were the original co-working spaces, albeit with a dress code that required waistcoats and wigs instead of hoodies and sneakers. So, could you handle a day in one of these revolutionary hotspots? It'd be a challenge, no doubt. The pace was frenetic, the stakes high, and the air thick with both opportunity and smoke. But if you could brave the discomfort, you'd find yourself at the heart of a financial revolution that would change the world. It was a place where fortunes were made, Dreams were dashed, and history was brewed one cup at a time. And as you sipped your coffee, you'd be part of a grand tapestry of innovation and enterprise that laid the foundation for the modern economy. In the next chapter of our story, we'll dive deeper into the social dynamics and power plays that took shape within these bustling coffee houses. But for now, let's leave our 18th century entrepreneurs to their risky ventures and return to a world where coffee comes with free Wi-Fi, and the only pirates we worry about are the ones downloading movies. And so, we peel back the veneer of the coffee houses, stepping into a realm where the air crackled not just with the hiss of boiling kettles, but with the seditious whisper of revolutionary ideas. Forget the cozy image of coffee as a simple morning pick-me-up. In the 18th century, it was more like rocket fuel for the mind, launching discussions that could, and often did, shake the very foundations of power. Imagine, if you will, a place where the chatter isn't about the weather or the latest cricket match, but about liberty, justice, and the occasional plot to overthrow a monarch. Coffee houses became the unofficial headquarters for political dissenters, the intellectual greenhouse for radical thinkers who pondered questions like, what if the king isn't appointed by divine right, but by popular consent? It was heady stuff, especially when you consider that openly questioning the monarchy could earn you a one-way ticket to the Tower of London, with a not-so-complimentary room and board. Now, the government, never one to miss a potential threat, quickly realized that these buzzing beehives of debate were breeding grounds for unrest. King Charles Roman II, a monarch not known for his fondness for lively debate, unless it involved a flattering portrait, felt the prick of paranoia. In 1675, he made a bold move to shut down these bastions of free thought. His proclamation declared coffee houses as places where the disaffected met, and spread scandalous reports concerning the conduct of His Majesty and his ministers. In other words, they were the 17th century equivalent of online forums filled with disgruntled users posting spicy takes about the government. But Charles' attempt to shudder these dens of dissent was about as successful as trying to keep a cat in a bag. The backlash was immediate and intense, akin to today's social media outrage. Public saw the move for what it was, an attempt to stifle free speech and public discourse. Within a few weeks, the ban was lifted, proving that even a king couldn't silence the caffeinated cries for liberty and justice. It was a short-lived victory, but a significant one, showing the power of collective voice over royal decree. These coffee houses weren't just chatterboxes of revolution, they were the printing presses of public opinion. Pamphlets, those feisty little leaflets, were as much a staple of coffee house culture as the brew itself. Writers like Daniel Defoe and Jonathan Swift churned out these paper missiles, each one a mini-explosive of satire and social commentary. You didn't just sip coffee, you consumed ideas, some as radical as the notion that the monarchy might not be the best form of government. Gasp! And let's not forget the ordinary folks, the artisans, the merchants, the clerks, who found their voices amplified within these walls. In a society structured by hierarchy, coffee houses flattened the playing field. You didn't need a title to have an opinion that mattered. A sharp tongue and a sharper mind could earn you a seat at the table, and in an era where your birth often determined your fate, that was revolutionary in its own right. This democratization of debate didn't go unnoticed across the Channel. French philosophers picked up the baton, running with it all the way to the Bastille. Voltaire, that arch-patriarch of wit and wisdom, was a coffee-house regular, no doubt using the bitter brew to fuel his fiery critiques of authority. As the Enlightenment spread, so did the idea that maybe, just maybe, the people should have a say in their own governance. Revolutionary, absolutely. Dangerous, you bet. But let's pause for a moment and debunk the idea that these were utopias of enlightened thought. Sure, they were cauldrons of intellectual ferment, but they were also rife with misinformation and rumor. If you thought today's fake news was a modern invention, think again. In these smoke-filled rooms, facts were as malleable as the wax seals on letters, and a juicy rumor could spread faster than a sneeze in flu season. It was the wild west of information, where skepticism was your best defense. The influence of coffee houses extended beyond the political. They were social laboratories where new ideas about society and governance were tested in real time. They laid bare the tensions between tradition and progress, between authority and autonomy. The discussions held in these crowded rooms were not just academic. They were the first drafts of the modern social contract. And yet, for all their revolutionary potential, coffee houses were also a paradox. They promoted equality of ideas, but not always of people. Women were largely excluded from these debates, relegated to the domestic sphere, while their male counterparts sipped and schemed. It was a glaring blind spot in the otherwise egalitarian ethos of the coffee house, a reminder that the march of progress often stumbled over its own imperfections. Still, the impact of these establishments was undeniable. They were the crucibles of change, where the heat of debate forged new ideologies. As the 18th century unfolded, the ideas brewed over countless cups of coffee began to seep into the public consciousness, gradually reshaping the landscape of power. So, could you handle the heat of an 18th century coffee house with its intoxicating mix of danger and possibility? Would you revel in the chaos or retreat from the cacophony? Either way, you'd bear witness to the birth of modern political thought, a revolution in slow motion, one cup at a time. And as you sip your brew, consider the enduring power of these spaces, where the clatter of cups once mingled with the clamor for change, leaving a legacy as rich and layered as the coffee itself. So, as you sip your brew, consider the enduring power of these spaces, where the clatter of cups once mingled with the clamor for change, leaving a legacy as rich and layered as the coffee itself. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, where the humble coffee house has transformed into the global juggernaut of Starbucks, Costa Coffee, and countless indie cafes vying for your caffeine-fueled affection. Today's coffee culture, with its Instagrammable latte art and chill playlists, might seem a world away from the smoke-filled rooms of 18th century London, but scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find echoes of the past. Let's debunk the myth of the leisurely coffee-sipping experience, both then and now. The romantic notion of whiling away hours in serene contemplation is as misleading as a decaf espresso. The truth, back in the day, was a bustling, frenetic scene where the only thing more abundant than the noise was the ambition. You weren't just sipping. You were strategizing, networking, and maybe even plotting a revolution. Fast forward to today, and while the clamor might be more subdued, the drive remains the same. Is it any wonder the modern cafe is often packed with freelancers and entrepreneurs tapping away at laptops, converting caffeine into code and creativity? But let's not get too misty-eyed about this legacy. The gritty reality of those 18th century coffee houses would make even the most ardent hipster pause mid-sip. Overcrowded and understaffed, they were less a haven of tranquility and more a test of endurance. You had to jostle for space, elbowing your way to a bench, battling body heat and tobacco smoke. It's a far cry from the plush armchairs and climate-controlled comfort of today. And while modern cafes might suffer the occasional Wi-Fi outage, at least you're not ducking under the threat of chamber parts being emptied from above. Economically, coffee houses were a marvel. They democratized access to information and ideas, a precursor to the open-access ethos of the Internet. For a penny, a princely sum, yet achievable, you bought a ticket to a world of knowledge and connection. It's like paying for premium content before the age of paywalls. And that penny, it was roughly equivalent to about £5 today, a small price for a front-row seat to the intellectual theatre of the time. However, let's not romanticize their egalitarian spirit too much. While these spaces blurred class lines to some extent, they were far from inclusive paradises. Remember, women were largely barred from these caffeinated crucibles of change, their voices relegated to the periphery. It took centuries for women to claim their rightful place in the public sphere, a testament to the enduring struggle for equality that had its seeds sown in those very coffee houses, albeit in absentia. Now, you might wonder if you could handle a day in this historical caffeine jungle. It's one thing to enjoy a flat white in a cozy nook, quite another to immerse yourself in the chaotic energy of a coffee house circa 1700. The relentless pace, the sensory overload, and the fierce intellectual combat could leave you breathless, not to mention the lack of modern conveniences like Wi-Fi or soy milk. It's a survival of the wittiest, where your ability to keep up with rapid-fire debates and dodging dubious hygiene practices determined your place in the social pecking order. Yet, these coffee houses were more than just venues for spirited debate or business deals. They were the crucibles where modern social and business practices were forged. The very concept of networking, of building connections over a shared cup, finds its roots here. They were the original co-working spaces, where proximity bred innovation and collaboration. Think of them as the 18th century LinkedIn, only with more actual face time and fewer endorsements. In the end, the legacy of these bustling, overcrowded spaces is as complex as the brew they served. They were the beating heart of a society in transition, a testament to the power of ideas to transcend the barriers of class and convention. And while the romanticized image of leisurely sips might not hold up under scrutiny, the reality was far more compelling. It was a world where the mundane and the extraordinary collided, where history was brewed one cup at a time. So next time you're sipping your artisanal espresso, take a moment to appreciate the clamor and chaos of those early coffee houses. They remind us that progress is often messy, that innovation requires a willingness to embrace discomfort, and that sometimes the most profound changes begin not with a roar, but with a humble cup of coffee. In a world where the pace of change is relentless, perhaps the greatest lesson we can learn from these historical caffeine hubs is that a little chaos, a little grit, and a lot of coffee can go a long way in shaping the future. The United States Civil War didn't just pop out of nowhere like an uninvited party guest. It had roots deeper than a southern magnolia tree. Let's peel back the layers of this not-so-civil conflict to see how a nation that once declared all men created equal ended up fighting over who exactly qualified as all men. At the heart of this whole kerfuffle were two regions with about as much in common as oil and water, the industrializing North and the agrarian South. Picture the North as the nerdy kid in class, wearing glasses and carrying a stack of books. This region was riding high on an industrial boom powered by steam engines and ambitious immigrants. Factories popped up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, cranking out steel, textiles, and a whole lot of attitude. By 1860, the North was producing 97% of the nation's firearms and 94% of its cloth. It was like the Amazon warehouse of the 19th century, except with more soot and fewer robots. Meanwhile, down south, life was a different affair altogether. Here, the economy was more about cotton fields than cotton mills. It was all about King Cotton, which wasn't just a catchy nickname. It was gospel truth. In 1860, the South was producing roughly two-thirds of the world's cotton supply. That's around 4 million bales, folks. And guess where those bales were going? Straight to the textile factories in the North and across the Atlantic to the voracious looms of Britain. Talk about an interdependent economy, kind of like being roommates who don't actually like each other but can't afford to move out. Now, you might think the South was just a bucolic wonderland of genteel plantation life, complete with mint juleps and genteel southern belles lounging on porches. But hold your horses, Scarlett O'Hara. The reality was far grimmer. The backbone of this cotton kingdom was the institution of slavery, an appallingly brutal system that reduced human beings to property. By the eve of the Civil War, there were about 4 million enslaved people in the South. That's as many people as live in Los Angeles today, all forced into a life of labor without freedom or rights. The economic tension was just one piece of the puzzle. Enter stage right, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This was Congress's first major attempt to keep the peace between the free North and the slave-holding South. It was like trying to keep a lid on a boiling pot with duct tape. The compromise allowed Missouri to enter as a slave state and Maine as a free state, keeping the balance of power in the Senate. However, it also drew a literal line at 36 degrees 30 latitude, north of which slavery was banned. It seemed like a neat solution, but in truth, it was just a band-aid over a gaping wound. Fast forward to 1857, when the Supreme Court decided to stir the pot with the Dred Scott decision. In a ruling that would make any modern-day lawyer cringe, the court declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be American citizens, and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court. As if that wasn't enough, they also ruled that the federal government had no power to regulate slavery in the territories. The decision was a bombshell, further polarizing an already divided nation. It was like throwing gasoline on a fire, and then acting surprised when everything went up in flames. So, there you have it. A country split by geography, economy, and ideology, with a cast of characters ranging from politicians trying to maintain a fragile peace to Supreme Court justices swinging for the fences with their rulings. These tensions were the kindling that would eventually ignite the conflagration known as the Civil War. And while the romance of the Old South might linger in books and movies, the harsh reality was that this was a society built on inequality and exploitation. As we dig deeper into the conflict, remember that beneath the iconic images and stirring speeches were real people living through tumultuous times. And trust me, folks, the story's just getting started. So, with the nation teetering on the edge of a very precarious precipice, enter stage left Abraham Lincoln, the tall, lanky lawyer from Illinois with a penchant for stovepipe hats and speaking his mind. When Lincoln was elected as the 16th President of the United States in November 1860, it felt less like a political win and more like someone had tossed a match into a room full of fireworks. You see, Lincoln wasn't just any candidate. He was the face of the newly formed Republican Party, which was about as popular in the South as a snowstorm at a beach party. The Republican platform was built on opposition to the expansion of slavery, which the South saw as an existential threat to their way of life. It's like telling someone their favorite TV show is getting cancelled and expecting them to take it calmly. Now, here's where things get interesting. Lincoln didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. Yes, you heard that right. Talk about a presidential candidate winning without a single vote from a sizable chunk of the electorate. Yet, win he did, thanks to an electoral college map that looked as blue as a Smurf's birthday party. Lincoln snagged 180 electoral votes, a comfortable majority in a four-way race where the competition squabbled like kids fighting over the last slice of pizza. But while Northern Republicans were popping champagne, or whatever they drank back then, the South was in full panic mode. The ink was barely dry on the election results before South Carolina decided it was time to pack its bags and leave the Union. On December 20, 1860, they officially seceded, with a declaration that sounded eerily like a breakup letter. It's not us, it's you, and your refusal to respect our peculiar institution. This wasn't just a case of sour grapes, though. It was the first domino in a chain reaction that would lead to the secession of 10 more states. Within a few months, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina had all followed suit. It was like watching a high-stakes game of follow the leader, with the stakes being the very fabric of the nation. Meanwhile, up in Washington, D.C., outgoing President James Buchanan was proving about as effective as a chocolate teapot. His response to the secession crisis was a masterclass in dithering. He declared secession illegal, but also insisted that the federal government didn't have the authority to force states to stay. It was a classic case of having your cake and eating it too, except it left the Union more divided than a pie at a family reunion. As the southern states were busy setting up their own government, they chose Jefferson Davis as the president of the newly minted Confederate States of America. Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, was a reluctant secessionist, but a staunch defender of Southern rights. Picture him as the guy who didn't really want to be at the party, but ended up hosting it. Under Davis's leadership, the Confederacy adopted their own constitution, which was like the U.S. version, but with more emphasis on states' rights, and of course, protection of slavery. They even moved their capital to Richmond, Virginia, setting up shop just 100 miles from Washington, D.C. Talk about awkward neighbors. Of course, all this posturing wasn't just about political ideology. It was also a grand economic gamble. The Confederacy was betting that King Cotton would be their ace in the hole. They figured that Britain's textile industry was so dependent on southern cotton that the British would come running to their aid. Spoiler alert, they were wrong. While British mills were indeed hungry for cotton, they were also wary of entangling themselves in a messy American conflict. Plus, they had stockpiles of cotton and were eyeing other sources, like Egypt and India, faster than you can say, past the tea and crumpets. Back in the States, tensions were boiling over like a pot of forgotten spaghetti. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, on April 12, 1861. Major Robert Anderson, a Union officer commanding the fort, found himself in a bit of a pickle. Surrounded by Confederate forces under General P, P.G.T. Beauregard, Anderson was ordered to surrender. When he refused, the Confederates opened fire. The bombardment lasted 34 hours, and while it might sound like a scene straight out of an action movie, it was more about strategic positioning than bloodshed. Remarkably, there were no fatalities during the battle itself, though a few unfortunate accidents during the surrender ceremonies claimed lives. The fall of Fort Sumter was the spark that ignited the full-scale conflict. Lincoln, now faced with a rebellion, called for 75,000 volunteers to quash the insurrection. The response was overwhelming in the North, where the call to arms was met with patriotic fervor. Meanwhile, in the South, Lincoln's call to arms was seen as the ultimate provocation, leading even more states to join the Confederate cause. Suddenly, the country was caught in a whirlwind of war fever, and there was no turning back. As the nation braced itself for the coming storm, both sides were convinced they'd be home by Christmas. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a long, brutal slog that would redefine the United States. But that's a story for another day, or at least another chapter. Hang tight, because the Civil War saga has only just begun, and the next part promises more battles, more politics, and more of the human drama that makes history so compelling. Keep your powder dry and your eyes peeled. Things are about to get even more interesting. With the winds of war howling, and both sides girding their loins for the epic showdown. Let's fast forward to the first major clash of the Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run. Picture this. It's July 21, 1861, and the fields of Manassas, Virginia, are about to host a spectacle that would make any Hollywood director salivate. The Union, confident as a peacock strutting its feathers, thought they'd give those pesky Confederates a good thrashing and be back home before the dinner bell. Reality check. They were in for a rude awakening. On one side, you had General Irvin McDowell leading the Union forces. McDowell, bless his heart, was as green as the recruits he commanded. His plan was to outflank the Confederate left, a tactic that looked good on paper but fell apart like a cheap tent in a thunderstorm. Meanwhile, Confederate generals Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard were cooking up a little surprise of their own, shuffling reinforcements by rail, a move that was the 19th century version of pulling an ace out of your sleeve. As the battle raged, both sides quickly realized they were in over their heads. Confederate General Thomas J. Jackson earned his famous nickname, Stonewall, as his brigade stood firm against Union attacks, creating a human dam that turned the tide. Casualties piled up like logs in a jam, with nearly 5,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The Union Army's retreat turned into a full-blown rout, complete with panicked soldiers tripping over picnicking spectators who had come to watch the glorious battle. For the Union, it was a sobering slap in the face, a reminder that this war would be neither short nor sweet. With Bull Run in the rearview mirror, both sides rolled up their sleeves for a long haul. Enter George B. McClellan, the new Union commander, who was as meticulous as he was hesitant, known as Little Mac. He was a master organizer, transforming the ragtag Union Army into the well-oiled machine known as the Army of the Potomac. His Achilles heel, a reluctance to engage, often overestimating enemy strength and second-guessing himself like a contestant on a cooking show. Meanwhile, the South had its own rock star in Robert E. Lee, a West Point graduate with the charisma of a movie star and the strategic mind of a chess grandmaster. Lee took the reins of the Confederate Army in 1862. Lee's audacity was unparalleled, and his ability to read the battlefield was like watching a maestro conduct an orchestra. Under his leadership, the Confederates scored victories in the 7 days' battles, frustrating Union attempts to capture Richmond. But war, as they say, is a fickle mistress. Lee's aggressive tactics, while often brilliant, came at a cost. The Maryland campaign culminated in the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, a day that would go down in history as the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. With over 23,000 casualties, the fields near Sharpsburg, Maryland, looked more like the aftermath of a natural disaster than a battle. McClellan, with his usual caution, failed to deliver a decisive blow, allowing Lee's army to slip back across the Potomac. Yet Antietam was a strategic Union victory, giving President Lincoln the momentum to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, a game-changer that redefined the war from a fight to preserve the Union to a battle for human freedom. Let's not forget the Western theater, where Ulysses S. Grant was making a name for himself. The man once considered a washed-up soldier was now the Union's bulldog, taking Forts Henry and Donelson in early 1862 with a determination that would make even the most stubborn mule sit up and take notice. When Grant captured Donelson, he demanded unconditional and immediate surrender, a phrase that would stick like glue to his reputation. Grant's greatest test came at Shiloh in April 1862, where the Confederates launched a surprise attack that nearly pushed Union forces into the Tennessee River. But Grant, unshakable as ever, counterattacked the next day, securing a hard-fought victory. The cost? A staggering 23,000 casualties, a grim reminder that both sides were locked in a war of attrition that would bleed them dry. As the war dragged on, the battles became bloodier, the strategies more desperate. The Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862 was a brutal affair, with Union forces under General Ambrose Burnside launching futile assaults against entrenched Confederates. Picture a meat grinder, and you'll get the idea. The Union suffered over 12,000 casualties, leaving the Army of the Potomac licking its wounds in the cold Virginia winter. Chancellorsville in May 1863 was another feather in Lee's cap, where he outmaneuvered Union General Joseph Hooker with a daring flanking maneuver that left the Union Army reeling. Yet, it was a bittersweet victory for the Confederates. Stonewall Jackson was mortally wounded by friendly fire, a loss as devastating to Lee as losing a limb. And then, the pivotal moment. Gettysburg, July 1-3, 1863. This wasn't just a battle. It was the Civil War's high-water mark, a clash of titans that would shape the course of history. Lee, emboldened by previous victories, launched a second invasion of the North, aiming to strike a blow on Union soil that might tip the scales in favor of the Confederacy. But Union General George Meade, newly appointed and as unassuming as a librarian, had other plans. The fighting raged for 3 days, each more ferocious than the last. On the third day, Lee ordered Pickett's charge, a frontal assault across open fields against the Union center. It was the military equivalent of charging a brick wall with a paper sword. The result was catastrophic for the Confederates, with over half of Pickett's division lying dead or wounded. The Union victory at Gettysburg, combined with Grant's capture of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, turned the tide of war, though both sides were left with a staggering butcher's bill. Gettysburg was a turning point, but not the final act. As the war ground on, both sides faced mounting challenges, dwindling resources, flagging morale, and a nation weary of bloodshed. Yet, the relentless march of history waits for no man, and the stories of these battles are just part of the tapestry that would ultimately redefine a nation divided. Stay tuned, because the drama unfolding in the remaining acts will keep you on the edge of your seat. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. But while the soldiers clashed on the battlefield back home, the war was playing out on an entirely different stage. The home front was a theater of its own, filled with economic strains, social upheaval, and not a single mint julep in sight. Sorry, Southern Belle enthusiasts. Instead, this era saw the rise of women and African Americans stepping into roles that would forever alter the social fabric of the nation. Let's start with the economic powerhouse that was the Union. By 1863, the North was churning out goods like a caffeinated assembly line. Thanks to its industrial infrastructure, the Union was producing vast quantities of war supplies, everything from boots to bullets. In fact, by 1864, the northern states had manufactured over 1.5 million firearms. That's enough to arm every man, woman, and child in a mid-sized city today. The economy was a well-oiled machine, literally and figuratively, with railroads crisscrossing the land like a spider web, enabling the swift movement of troops and supplies. And let's not forget the ironclads, those fearsome warships that looked like something out of a steampunk novel. The Union had over 600 ships by the end of the war, effectively blockading Confederate ports and squeezing the South like a python on a pack of mice. Contrast this with the Confederacy, where the economic picture was bleaker than a rainy day at a picnic. The South's reliance on agriculture, primarily cotton, was like putting all your eggs in a very fragile basket. When the Union blockade kicked in, it was like someone locked the pantry and threw away the key. The Confederacy struggled to import the goods it desperately needed, from shoes to saddles, not to mention the ever-crucial munitions. And while cotton was supposed to be their golden ticket, the Brits weren't as keen on playing their part in this economic charade as the South had hoped. By 1863, the Southern economy was in tatters, and inflation was skyrocketing. Confederate money was worth about as much as monopoly bills. By 1865, $1 in Confederate currency was equivalent to just 6 cents in Union currency. That's right, folks, you'd need a wheelbarrow full of Confederate cash to buy a loaf of bread. Now, onto the social changes. Women, who had always been the backbone of households, were now stepping up in ways previously unimagined. With men off fighting, women rolled up their sleeves and got to work, managing farms, working in factories, and serving as nurses, a job that was as dangerous as it was essential. Clara Barton, anyone. This powerhouse of a woman was not only a battlefield nurse, but also the founder of the American Red Cross. Talk about multitasking under pressure. And then there's the myth of the Southern Belle, lounging on a veranda while chaos unfolded around her. In reality, many Southern women were knee-deep in the mud of their own challenges. They had to improvise to keep households running, often using wallpaper paste to make bread or substituting chicory for coffee. These women were less about sipping mint juleps and more about keeping the home fires burning while their worlds were turned upside down. And let's not forget the African Americans who played a pivotal role in this era. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln in 1863, was a game-changer. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be freed. This wasn't just a moral stance. It was a strategic move to undermine the Southern economy and military. Imagine the shockwaves this sent through the South, where enslaved people were the backbone of the agricultural workforce. Over the course of the war, nearly 200,000 African-American men served in the Union Army and Navy. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official African-American units, showed incredible valor at the assault on Fort Wagner, proving that courage knows no color. On the civilian front, African-American women were also breaking new ground. They worked as nurses, cooks, and laundresses, supporting the Union war effort in any way they could. And let's not overlook the underground network of spies and scouts, many of whom were African Americans risking their lives to gather crucial intelligence. Harriet Tubman, known for her work with the Underground Railroad, also served as a Union spy and scout. Her intelligence gathering was instrumental in the Combahee River Raid, which freed over 700 enslaved people. Talk about a legend. As the war dragged on, the strain was palpable on both sides. In the North, despite its industrial might, there were draft riots, most famously the New York City draft riots of 1863, where the streets ran red for 4 days, leaving over 100 dead. The working-class Irish immigrants, feeling the pinch of conscription and competition from freed African Americans for jobs, took to the streets in violent protest. It was a grim reminder that not everyone was on the same page about the war's objectives. Meanwhile, in the South, food shortages were as common as a summer's day. The Richmond bread riot of 1863 saw a mob of women, driven by hunger and desperation, march to the Confederate capital demanding bread. When their pleas were ignored, they resorted to looting. It was a stark testament to the fact that the Southern home front was crumbling under the weight of war. So, while the soldiers fought with bayonets and cannons on the battlefield, those left behind were caught in their own battles with scarcity and change. The Civil War was a crucible that tested the mettle of all Americans, reshaping society in ways that would echo long after the last cannon was silenced. But hold onto your hats, because the story isn't over yet. There's more drama, more transformation, and more history to unpack as we march ever closer to the war's tumultuous conclusion. As the smoke cleared, and the last echoes of cannon fire faded into the distant hills, the United States emerged from the Civil War not as a united nation, but as a patchwork quilt of shattered dreams and smoldering resentments. The war's staggering toll was enough to make even the most hardened cynic flinch. More than 620,000 soldiers had perished, a grim reminder that in the game of war, the house always wins. To put it in perspective, That's roughly equivalent to the entire population of modern-day Baltimore, wiped out by a conflict that had once seemed like a quick and noble adventure. And the financial cost, a jaw-dropping $5, $2 billion, a sum that could have bought an endless supply of top hats for Lincoln or funded a railroad to the moon. Yet, as the nation stood on the brink of reconstruction, it was clear that the real cost of the war couldn't be measured in dollars or lives alone. This was a nation that had to reinvent itself, to stitch its moral fabric back together while grappling with the ghosts of its past. Enter the era of Reconstruction, a period more turbulent than a summer thunderstorm and almost as unpredictable. The task was daunting. Reunite a country that had been tearing at its own seams for years, while simultaneously figuring out what to do with the approximately 4 million formerly enslaved individuals who were suddenly, bewilderingly, free. The initial attempts at reconstruction were as rocky as a mountain goat's commute. President Andrew Johnson, who took the reins after Lincoln's assassination, was about as effective as a screen door on a submarine. He was all about leniency, pardoning former Confederates like they were wayward schoolchildren who'd just broken a window. His policies made radical Republicans in Congress clutch their pearls in horror. These were the folks who wanted more than a slap on the wrist for the South. They wanted fundamental change, ensuring that the newly freed African Americans could claim their rightful place in society. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 were Congress's way of saying, "Step aside. Andy, we'll take it from here." They divided the South into military districts, each governed by Union troops. It was a move straight out of a dystopian novel, but it was necessary to enforce the new amendments that were reshaping the Constitution. The 13th Amendment had already abolished slavery, but the 14th and 15th Amendments were the real game changers. They granted citizenship and suffrage to African American men, respectively, laying the groundwork for a society that could, at least on paper, live up to the Declaration of Independence's lofty ideals. But let's not sugarcoat it. Reconstruction was no fairy tale. While the amendments were a step in the right direction, the path to equality was littered with obstacles that would make an Olympic hurdler weep. The South was a hotbed of resistance, with groups like the Ku Klux Klan springing up like weeds in a neglected garden. They used intimidation and violence to suppress African American political participation, showing that old prejudices died harder than a villain in a bad horror movie. Economically, the South was in shambles. Its infrastructure had been battered by 4 years of war, and the plantation economy that had once fueled its wealth was as dead as disco. Sharecropping became the new norm, a system that promised opportunity but often delivered a cycle of debt and dependency. It was like swapping one form of bondage for another, a harsh reality that was a far cry from the romantic notion of a reborn South. Meanwhile, the North faced its own set of challenges. Industrial growth surged forward like a runaway train, transforming the nation's landscape with smoke-belching factories and teeming urban centers. And while this industrial boom was a boon for some, it wasn't without its dark side. Labor strikes and social unrest bubbled beneath the surface, the inevitable backlash to a system that often valued profit over people. As the 19th century drew to a close, the legacy of the Civil War continued to cast a long shadow over American society. The civil rights movements of the 20th century were born from the ashes of Reconstruction, a testament to the enduring struggle for equality and justice. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks would later become the torchbearers of this ongoing fight, but their path had been cleared by those who had dared to dream during the tumultuous years that followed the war. The divide between North and South, while less violent, persisted in subtle ways. Cultural differences, political leanings, and economic disparities remained as reminders of a past that refused to be neatly boxed up and stored away. The lost cause myth emerged, painting the Confederacy as a noble endeavor rather than a rebellion rooted in the defense of slavery. It was a narrative that tried to gloss over the brutal realities of history with a veneer of Southern charm, but like all myths, it was more fantasy than fact. In the end, the Civil War and its aftermath were a crucible that tested the United States in ways that few could have predicted. It was a time of extraordinary change, where ideals were challenged and new paths were forged. The lessons of this era are as relevant today as they were then, reminding us that the cost of division is steep, and the road to unity is never easy. So, there you have it, an epic tale of conflict, transformation, and resilience. The Civil War wasn't just a chapter in a history book. It was a pivotal moment that shaped the nation we know today. As we reflect on this turbulent period, let's remember that our history is a tapestry woven from the threads of triumph and tragedy. And while the stories of the past are often complex and messy, they hold the key to understanding who we are and who we aspire to be. The rooster's crow is less a gentle wake-up call and more a screeching reminder that you're about to face the day in a colonial settlement. You blink awake, lying on what can only generously be called a bed. It's more of a lumpy collection of straw trying its best to impersonate a mattress. Welcome to the 17th century, where your morning routine is less about choosing the right Instagram filter and more about surviving till sundown. As you peer around, the first thing you notice is that the concept of floor is a flexible one. In reality, you're staring at a hardened patch of dirt that serves as your living room, dining room, and, well, everything room. Forget about central heating or even a decent rug. This is the era where a dirt floor is standard, and you're supposed to be grateful it isn't mud. And don't even think about flipping on a light switch to brighten your morning. Electricity. That's something your great-great-grandkids might enjoy. Now, let's talk about getting ready for the day. Need to freshen up? Good luck with that. Your bathroom is a bucket, and your plumbing consists of a trip to the nearest stream, which might be more of a trickle if the weather's been dry. And let's be real. Hygiene isn't exactly a top priority when surviving is the name of the game. You're more worried about keeping warm and fed than smelling like a meadow. Speaking of staying fed, breakfast isn't a gourmet affair. If you've got bread, congratulations, you're living the colonial dream. But don't expect it to be anything like a modern baguette. Think more along the lines of something that could double as a building material. And if you're lucky enough to have a little salt to sprinkle on that bread, you're living large. Salt is a big-ticket item, often traded like it's gold dust. In fact, salt was so valuable that people sometimes used it as currency. That's because it had to make the long and perilous journey from Europe to your little corner of the New World, picking up quite the price tag along the way. Fancy a sweet treat instead? Good luck with that. Sugar is such a rarity that when you get your hands on even a small amount, it's a cause for celebration. Think of it as a colonial lottery win. Like salt, sugar's price reflects its arduous journey across the Atlantic, and it's as precious as it is scarce. You'll need deep pockets or good connections to enjoy its sweet, sweet goodness. And let's not even talk about spices. If your food is bland, it's because pepper and cinnamon are practically luxury goods meant for the upper crust or special occasions. But hey, you're not here just to sit around, right? There's work to be done, and lots of it. The colonial life is all about the grind. Literally, if you're milling grain or pounding corn. Forget about the 9 to 5. Your workday starts with the sun and ends with it. You're laboring to grow enough food to make it through the winter, and every day is a race against time and elements. This isn't some pastoral idyll. It's a rough and tumble world where your survival depends on your ability to work the land with whatever tools you've got, often just your own 2 hands and a prayer. Now, let's dispel a little myth while we're at it. You might have heard tales of colonial life as some sort of bucolic paradise, a world where everyone was self-sufficient and lived in harmony with nature. Yeah, not so much. Life is hard, precarious, and often brutally short. Forget any notions of rugged individualism leading to easy prosperity. The reality is that you're part of a community, and everyone's survival depends on each other. That's why you're constantly trading, bartering, and working together, not just to thrive, but to survive. And those romanticized images of pilgrims and Native Americans breaking bread together. Well, let's just say the truth is a tad more complicated and often a whole lot darker. As the morning wears on, you might start to feel the pinch in your wallet, or whatever passes for a wallet in your leather pouch. Goods are scarce, and prices are high. That's because everything from tools to textiles has to be imported from Europe, often taking months to arrive. The supply chain is a nightmare of logistical challenges and oceanic perils, leading to costs that would make a modern economist weep. For example, a single yard of cloth could set you back several weeks of wages, and a decent tool might cost as much as a cow. You're constantly calculating whether you can afford to fix the leaky roof or if you should save up for the next shipment of essentials. By now, you're probably realizing that the colonial experience is less about living the dream and more about surviving the nightmare. But hey, at least you're getting a workout. Every task is a full-body exercise, whether it's chopping wood, churning butter, or hauling water. Who needs a gym membership when your daily life is a CrossFit session? As you continue your day, remember that every moment is a lesson in resourcefulness. You learn to make do with what you've got and to appreciate the little things, like a warm fire or a fresh apple. Because in this world, those small comforts are what get you through the long, hard days. And as the sun begins its descent, you're already thinking about tomorrow's challenges, because there's no rest for the weary, not in a colonial settlement. So, as you settle in for the night, under a sky full of stars that look suspiciously like the ones we see today, minus the light pollution, you might just find yourself appreciating the grit and determination it took to make it through just one day. And maybe, just maybe, you're a little less romanticized about the past and a lot more appreciative of the present. Welcome to colonial life, where every day is a battle, every moment a test, and every person a survivor in the truest sense. If you thought your colonial day was tough already, buckle up, because it's about to get a whole lot rougher. After a morning that felt like a marathon, it's time to tackle the main event, the back-breaking, soul-crushing chores that define your new reality. Welcome to the labor-intensive world of colonial life, where fetching water isn't just a task, it's an endurance sport. First off, let's talk about your local water supply. Spoiler alert, it's neither local nor conveniently supplied. Forget the luxury of turning a tap. You're trekking to the nearest river or well, which could be a mile away. That's right, you're walking the equivalent of a 5K just to fill a bucket. And let's be honest, a colonial bucket isn't exactly a lightweight, ergonomic marvel. It's more like a heavy, splintery piece of wood that's one wrong move away from baptizing you with the cold embrace of muddy water. But hey, at least you're burning calories, right? Who needs a modern gym when you've got the original CrossFit routine right here? And this isn't just a daily jaunt. No, you're making multiple trips because a single bucket of water isn't going to cut it when you've got a household to run. So if you're counting steps, you're easily hitting 15,000 before lunch, which is probably why colonial settlers had the calves of a Greek god. Now, as you lug that sloshing bucket back, let's take a detour into the economic quagmire of colonial trade. You see, every drop of water you spill on the way home is a metaphor for the colonial economy. Everything is hard-won and easily lost. Water is just one example of how precious resources were in short supply, and that scarcity made goods expensive, which is why bartering was as common as complaining about the weather. Speaking of resources, let's shift gears to the grain-grinding extravaganza that occupies your afternoon. Welcome to the pre-industrial food prep Olympics. Your grain mill is basically two giant rocks with attitude problems. You're grinding wheat or corn by hand, and every twist of the millstone feels like a personal vendetta against carbs. If you're wondering why colonial folk seem to have a permanent scowl, it's probably because they were perpetually hangry from all this effort. Grinding grain isn't just a chore, it's a test of endurance. You're not just producing a loaf of bread, you're chiseling away at your own sanity. And let's not forget the constant threat of the millstone breaking. That would leave you in a bind, because repairing or replacing it means waiting for the next ship from Europe, an ordeal that makes modern shipping delays look like express delivery. And here's a fun fact for those of you keeping score at home. The average colonial person consumed around 3,000 calories a day. That's a lot of fuel, but when you're burning it off with manual labor from dawn till dusk, it's a necessity. So, while you might fantasize about a perfectly toasted slice of bread, the reality is that you're devouring it like it's the last meal on Earth. Now, let's dispel another myth. You might think that with all this manual labor, colonial folks were living the organic, farm-to-table lifestyle we envy today. But the truth is, their diet was dictated by necessity, not choice. They weren't munching on heirloom tomatoes and artisanal cheese. They were eating whatever would keep them alive. And when your choices are limited to what you can grow, catch, or barter for, your menu is as predictable as a colonial winter, mostly bleak. But let's not wallow in the mud of reality too long. There's a silver lining in these clouds of hardship. All this toil and struggle fostered a sense of community and interdependence. When your survival depends on the success of the harvest or the goodwill of neighbors, You learn to appreciate the bonds of friendship and the shared determination that keeps your community afloat. It's a world where cooperation isn't just encouraged, it's essential. So, as you wipe the sweat from your brow and take a moment to catch your breath, consider this. Every grueling task is a testament to human resilience. Colonial life was built on the backs of those who refused to give up, even when the odds were stacked against them. And while it's easy to romanticize the past, the reality is that our ancestors were engaged in a daily battle against the elements, fatigue, and the ever-present specter of scarcity. And just when you think you might have a moment to rest, remember there's always another chore waiting in the wings. Perhaps it's chopping wood for the evening's fire, or maybe it's tending to the livestock. Either way, you're not done yet. Because in the colonial world, day isn't over until you collapse into that straw mattress, hoping for a few hours of sleep before the rooster's relentless crow signals the start of another grueling day. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over your settlement, you're left with a profound appreciation for the sheer grit it took to survive in such a demanding environment. It's a world where every day is a high-stakes game of endurance and ingenuity. And as you look back on your day, you might just find yourself thankful for the conveniences of modern life, even if it means sacrificing a little of that old-world charm. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows over your rough-hewn settlement, it's time to face the afternoon's grim realities. You might have heard that you are what you eat, but in colonial times, that saying is more of a threat than a mantra. Your gastronomic choices are limited, and by limited, I mean you're not exactly flipping through a menu. Instead, you're stuck with the holy trinity of the colonial diet: corn, pork, and more corn. Forget Michelin stars. Your dining experience is more like a culinary endurance test. Ever heard of hasty pudding? No, it's not a fast food dessert, but rather a colonial staple made from cornmeal mush. It's as thrilling as it sounds. You're essentially eating porridge, and not the Instagrammable kind with chia seeds and fresh fruit. The cornmeal mush is about as bland as a text from your dentist reminding you about your next cleaning. And if you're lucky enough to have a bit of molasses to drizzle over it, then congratulations, you've just upgraded your meal from gruel to edible. Now, onto the protein portion of your colonial diet, pork. But before you start dreaming of crispy bacon or a succulent pork chop, let's set the record straight. This pork is salt-cured and tough enough to double as a doorstop. It's called salt pork, and it's basically pork that's been preserved in enough salt to make the Dead Sea jealous. You're not savoring this stuff, you're surviving on it. Salt was essential, not just for flavor, but because it kept your meat from going bad. And given the lack of refrigeration, salted meat was the colonial version of a long-lasting protein bar. All right, so you've got corn and pork, but what about veggies? In theory, you could grow some, but the harsh realities of colonial farming often meant that vegetables were a seasonal luxury, not a daily guarantee. Potatoes might make an appearance if you're lucky, but they're more likely to be boiled into submission than mashed into buttery goodness. And if you're counting on a fresh salad, well, you might as well be wishing for a unicorn to trot by. Now, let's shift gears into the grim world of colonial medicine, a realm where the phrase, "just walk it off," might have been sound medical advice. You've got a headache. Here, bite on this leather strap while I bleed you with a rusty lancet. It's not that colonial physicians were sadists. They were just working with the best they had, which wasn't very much. Medicine was still in its infancy, and practices were as primitive as you'd imagine. Leeches, anyone. Let's talk about some of the common ailments that could turn your colonial life into a brief and painful affair. Scurvy, for example, was a real party pooper. Caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, scurvy was less about pirate stereotypes and more about bleeding gums, anemia, and downright misery. Fresh fruit and veggies could prevent it, but given the scarcity, you were more likely to encounter a unicorn than a citrus fruit. Then there's dysentery, an illness that could take you out faster than a colonial militia. It's a gastrointestinal nightmare, often caused by contaminated water. If you were unlucky enough to catch it, you were in for a rough ride. And remember that bucket you've been hauling water with? Yeah, that's part of the problem. The lack of sanitation meant that the water you drank was more of a gamble than a refreshment. Dysentery could decimate a settlement faster than you could say, "call the doctor." Which, by the way, wouldn't do much good since colonial doctors were often just a step above quacks. And speaking of medical charlatans, Let's not forget about the cures that were more like medieval torture. Got a fever? Try a nice mustard plaster to blister your skin and draw out those bad humors. Feeling faint? Let's get you some tobacco smoke enemas, because nothing says relief like smoke where the sun doesn't shine. It's a wonder anyone survived at all. So, why did people endure all this? Well, because they had no choice. The colonial world was a harsh and unforgiving place, but it was also a land of opportunity, or at least it promised to be. These settlers were pioneers, and they were driven by the hope of a better life, even if it meant suffering through the realities of a diet that could bore you to tears, and a medical system that seemed more inclined to kill you than cure you. The romantic image of the stoic settler bravely forging a new life is compelling, but let's not forget the truth beneath it. Survival was a daily struggle, and every small victory was hard won. You didn't just live in a colonial settlement. You battled it, day in and day out, with every meal you choked down and every ailment you endured. So, as you lay your weary head on that straw-stuffed mattress tonight, just remember, you're surviving history, one grueling day at a time. And as you drift off to an uneasy sleep, consider yourself lucky that you're not waking up to another day in the 17th century. As you drift into a restless sleep, dreaming of a world where your food isn't trying to kill you and your doctor isn't wielding a hacksaw, let's delve into the evening's social and political landscape. It's time to trade in your straw mattress for a front-row seat at the Colonial Town Hall meeting, a spectacle as riveting as it is revealing. Now, let's be honest. You've probably heard the tales of colonial America as a bastion of democracy, a place where everyone had a say and freedom rang from every rickety rooftop. Well, hold onto your tricorn hat, because this democratic utopia is more myth than reality. The truth is, colonial governance was about as inclusive as a 17th century country club. Male, white, landowning, and preferably of a certain social standing. Welcome to the decision-making table, everyone else. Better luck next century. Let's talk numbers. In some colonies, less than 10% of the population could actually vote. That's right, 90% of folks were left to twiddle their thumbs, while a privileged few made all the decisions. And don't forget, these decisions were heavily flavored by the whims of European politics, a strange brew of royal decrees, mercantilist policies, and the occasional war thrown in for good measure. So if you were hoping to have a say in your colonial community, good luck with that. Your local oligarchs have it covered. Thanks for asking. Now, you might wonder why anyone would stick around in such a system. Well, for many, the allure of land ownership was worth the democratic shortfall. Land was scarce and expensive in the old world, but in the new world, it represented opportunity. Forget about a white picket fence. Land ownership meant wealth, power, and influence. It was your ticket to the big leagues, provided you could hold on to it amidst the precarious politics and land disputes. But what about the rest of the social ladder? Below the landed gentry, you had a burgeoning middle class of artisans and tradespeople, hustling to make a living in this new world order. And then there were the laborers, the backbone of the colonial economy, often living a hair's breadth from destitution. If you were an indentured servant, your life was a ticking clock, counting down the years of labor you owed to your master in exchange for passage to the new world. Conditions were brutal, hours were long, and the promise of eventual freedom sometimes felt like a cruel joke. Let's not sugarcoat it. Indentured servitude was a raw deal. Historians estimate that roughly 50% of European immigrants to colonial America arrived as indentured servants. These folks were the original gig workers, bound by contracts that might as well have been written in blood. And while the romanticized image of working your way to freedom sounds noble, the reality was as grim as a New England winter. Many never lived to see their freedom dues, succumbing to disease, overwork, or just plain bad luck. And then we have the truly dark heart of the colonial economy, slavery. By the late 1600, the transatlantic slave trade was in full swing, bringing thousands of enslaved Africans to the colonies each year. Their labor was the engine driving the agricultural economy, particularly in the southern colonies, where cash crops like tobacco and rice were king. Slavery was not just a southern institution, though. Northern merchants grew wealthy off the trade, and enslaved people were a part of life in every colony. Slavery's impact on the colonial social structure was profound and devastating. It created a rigid racial hierarchy where people were property, families were torn apart, and humanity was denied. This wasn't just an economic convenience. It was a brutal system of oppression designed to maintain power and control. Yet, despite this harsh reality, myths of benevolent masters and contented enslaved people persist, glossing over the systemic cruelty that was a daily reality for so many. As European politics swirled like a storm cloud over the colonies, they brought with them not just economic policies, but also social and cultural norms. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and progress, began to seep into colonial life, challenging old beliefs and inspiring new ideas about governance and rights. But let's not get too carried away. These ideas were slow to take root, hampered by the entrenched interests of those at the top of the social pyramid. So, as you ponder the evening's revelations, it becomes clear that colonial life was a complex web of aspiration and oppression, opportunity and exploitation. The dream of a new world was often overshadowed by the harsh realities of the old one. Yet, for all its flaws, it was a world in motion, a place where the seeds of change were slowly, inexorably taking root. And as you prepare to face another grueling day, remember that history is not just the story of those who held power, but also of those who lived in its shadow. It's a tale of resilience and resistance, of people striving for a better life against daunting odds. As the colonial night deepens, you're left with a fuller picture of the world you're surviving, one that's richer and more complex than any romanticized tale could convey. Stay tuned, because the colonial saga is far from over, and there are more layers to peel back. Tomorrow promises fresh challenges and new insights into a world that's as fascinating as it is unforgiving. The rooster's crow will come all too soon, but for now, rest up. You'll need every ounce of strength to face the trials of another colonial day. As the rooster's crow approaches, let's wrap up your colonial crash course with a little reflection. By now, you've probably realized colonial life was less Little House on the Prairie and more Survivor, New World Edition. It's a game where the rewards are limited, the challenges are relentless, and the stakes are nothing short of survival. The romanticized tales of fearless pioneers braving the wilderness paint a picture of adventure, but the reality was a whole lot grimmer and a lot less glamorous. Consider this. In the brutal world of the 17th century, life expectancy hovered around the mid-30s. That's not because people were living fast and dying young. It's because life was a constant battle against disease, famine, and the elements. Infant mortality rates were staggering, with nearly 1 in 3 children not making it past their first year. If you were lucky enough to reach adulthood, congratulations, you were already defying the odds. These challenges were the crucible in which modern society was forged. They demanded resilience, ingenuity, and a communal spirit that, while often romanticized, was essential for survival. Let's bust another myth. The idea of the self-reliant pioneer is as much fiction as reality. Sure, rugged individualism sounds great in theory, but in practice, colonial life was all about collectivism. You needed your neighbors just as much as they needed you. Communities were tight-knit out of necessity, not just neighborly love. And let's not forget the economic dimensions that shaped this era. The colonial economy was a curious beast, a blend of barter, burgeoning commerce, and good old-fashioned subsistence farming. By the late 1600, the colonies were growing into economic engines, with the triangular trade routes making merchants rich and consumers dependent. Goods from Europe, Africa, and the colonies flowed through ports like Boston and Charleston, creating a global economy long before globalization was a buzzword. This economic backdrop is crucial when considering why people stayed in such harsh conditions. Land and opportunity were powerful lures, even if they came with a side of hardship. A plot of land meant more than just a farm. It was a symbol of independence and a shot at prosperity, albeit a long shot. It's no wonder people were willing to endure so much for a taste of potential freedom and fortune. Yet, despite these hardships, the colonial era holds a certain allure. Perhaps it's the nostalgia for a simpler time, a world where grit and determination were the currency of the day. But let's be clear, this nostalgia is often rose-tinted. The past may seem enchanting from afar, but up close, it's more grit than glamour. The colonial era was a time of brutal realities, where every day was a test of endurance and ingenuity. Still, there's a reason we keep coming back to these stories. They remind us of the resilience and resourcefulness of those who came before us. They push us to question the sanitized versions of history we often hear and dig deeper for truths that matter. The colonial period is a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile life can be and how hard-won every small victory was. As we close the chapter on your colonial adventure, let's not forget the legacy these settlers left behind. Their struggles laid the groundwork for a nation that would eventually prize liberty and opportunity, even if those ideals took centuries to fully materialize. Their experiences influenced the development of American culture, politics, and society in ways that still resonate today. So, as you drift off, leaving behind the hardships of a colonial day, take with you the lessons learned. Appreciate the conveniences of modern life, the ease with which we access food, water, and medical care. Remember the grit of those who faced monumental challenges and forged ahead anyway. They were not heroes in the romantic sense, but survivors in the truest sense. And in that survival lies a story as enduring as it is enlightening, one that continues to shape our present and inspire our future. Smell of horse dung and fermented mare's milk wafts through the air, and congratulations, you're now a Mongol nomad. Forget the silk robes and grand yurts you've seen in movies. Your reality is more about surviving on the harsh steppes where the grass is sparse. The winters are brutal, and the word comfort is as rare as a unicorn. Your home is a yurt, or jur, if we're getting fancy with the local lingo. It's a round tent made of felt and wood, designed to be portable because, well, you're nomadic. Packing it up and moving takes less than an hour, assuming you haven't misplaced any pegs. It's not just your home, it's your fortress against the elements. With temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, you can bet that insulation is your best friend. And yes, that means you're living in a well-insulated, portable cave of yak skin and wool. Cozy, right. When it comes to food, you're not exactly spoiled for choice. Your diet is a culinary ode to meat and dairy. Mongolia's 13th century food pyramid is basically a triangle with two sections, meat and more meat. Occasionally, there's a fermented drink called erag, made from mare's milk. It's like a Mongol milkshake, but with a kick stronger than vodka. You'd better like it because water can be as elusive as a mirage in the Gobi Desert. Your day-to-day life involves rigorous physical training. And no, CrossFit didn't invent the concept of functional fitness. You're riding horses by the age of 4, which is also when you're learning to wield a bow. This isn't just child's play, it's survival training. The steppes are your training ground, and every ride across the endless plains is a rehearsal for the battles you might face. The bow is your weapon of choice, and you're expected to hit a target the size of a coin from 200 meters away. Yeah, no pressure, kid. Now, let's tackle the myth of the noble savage. Romantic, isn't it? The idea of you as a free-spirited warrior living in harmony with nature. But here's the scoop. Life is more about survival than serenity. The Mongol way is one of adaptation and resilience. When you're not busy hunting or raiding neighboring tribes for resources, you're strategizing just how to stay alive. It's not a lifestyle choice, it's a necessity. The steppes are unforgiving, and so are you. The truth is, the Mongol nomads were as pragmatic as they were fierce. They developed a system of laws known as the Yasa, attributed to Genghis Khan. It was a strict code that unified the Mongol tribes under one banner. The Yasa wasn't just about governance, it was about survival. It regulated everything from theft to the treatment of animals, ensuring that everyone played by the same rules or faced the consequences. Living in this world means accepting a certain level of brutality. You're not just a warrior, you're part of a society that honed its skills in the art of war out of necessity. The stories of Mongol raids aren't fiction, they're a testament to the harsh reality of life on the steppes. When resources are scarce, you take what you need. And if that means raiding a neighboring tribe, so be it. Survival doesn't come with a moral handbook, it comes with a set of tactics. So, while the romanticized version of your life might paint you as a gallant rider with the wind in your hair, the reality is you're more likely to have dirt in your teeth and blisters on your hands. But here's the twist. You wouldn't trade it for the world. The Mongol nomad life is one of constant movement and adaptation, a relentless push against the elements, and a testament to human endurance. It's raw, it's real, and it's uniquely yours. And while the Mongol nomad life is undeniably rugged, there's a certain genius lurking beneath all that grit and grime. You see, the Mongols weren't just swinging swords and shooting arrows willy-nilly. They were conducting a masterclass in economic strategy. Forget the fairy tale of endless pillaging and plundering. This was an empire that thrived on efficiency and innovation. Let's dive into the economic engine that powered the Mongol conquests, where the balance sheet was as crucial as the battlefield. First off, the Mongols had a knack for resource management that would make any modern CEO weep with envy. They were like the Mac Jivers of medieval warfare, using every bit of their environment to their advantage. The steppes might have been harsh, but they were rich in one invaluable resource: horses. And not just any horses. These were tough, resilient, and could practically run on Arag. Each warrior typically had 4 to 6 horses, rotating between them to avoid exhaustion. This meant the Mongol cavalry could cover up to 100 miles a day, leaving their enemies eating dust and wondering what hit them. Talk about horsepower. Now, let's talk about the Mongol army itself, which was less about brute force and more about strategic brilliance. Picture this: Genghis Khan, the Grandmaster strategist himself, organizing his warriors into units based on the decimal system. A squad of 10, called an arban, was the building block of this military machine. Scale that up to a Tumen, which was 10,000 strong, and you've got a force that could overwhelm entire kingdoms. But it wasn't just about numbers. It was about flexibility and coordination. These units could operate independently or combine into massive, synchronized assaults. It's like the Mongol army was the original transformer, more than meets the eye. And while we're busting myths, let's take a sledgehammer to the idea that the Mongols were just a band of marauders. Sure, they raided, but there was method to their madness. Conquests weren't about short-term gains. They were about building a sustainable empire. Genghis Khan knew that plunder was fleeting, but trade was eternal. Under his reign, the Silk Road became a bustling superhighway of commerce, connecting the east and west like never before. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory, they created a global marketplace. Think of it as ancient globalization, minus the stock market crashes. But maintaining such a vast empire wasn't cheap. Few taxes. And no, we're not talking about a few coins here and there. This was a sophisticated system designed to keep the wheels of the empire turning smoothly. The Mongols implemented a tax known as the Kubcha, a levy on goods that passed through their territories. Imagine the Silk Road as a toll road, with the Mongols as the ultimate gatekeepers. They also levied taxes on conquered peoples, but in a stroke of economic genius, they often retained local administrators to ensure the system ran efficiently. After all, why reinvent the wheel when you can just keep it spinning? Now, here's a plot twist for the ages: the Mongol postal system. You might think of postal services as quaint or mundane, but back then, it was revolutionary. The Yam, as it was called, was a vast network of relay stations that facilitated communication across the empire. It was like FedEx, but with more horses and fewer tracking numbers. Messengers could travel up to 200 miles a day, thanks to the fresh mounts and supplies waiting at each station. This allowed the Mongols to maintain control and coordination over their sprawling territories. It's the medieval equivalent of having Wi-Fi in the middle of nowhere, priceless. So, when you picture the Mongol Empire, don't just imagine a whirlwind of destruction. Picture a well-oiled machine, a marvel of logistics and strategy that reshaped the world. The Mongols weren't just conquerors. They were master planners, merging military might with economic savvy. They understood that to rule the world, you needed more than just an army. You needed vision. Stay tuned, because the saga of Mongol ingenuity isn't over yet. Now, let's take a peek behind the curtain of Mongol society, where the social structure was as layered as the world's most complex lasagna, but with considerably more bite. At the top, you've got your Khans, the big cheeses, the rulers who commanded not just armies, but the very fabric of Mongol life. Below them, a web of nobility and commoners, all bound together by loyalty and ambition. But wait, there's more, because no one does hierarchy quite like the Mongols, and it's a tale that might surprise you. You see, Mongol society wasn't just a testosterone-fueled man cave. Nope, women played a pivotal role, and not just in the kitchen or yurt. The ladies of the steppes were leaders, warriors, and decision-makers. Take Holan, the mother of Genghis Khan, who was more than just a footnote in history. She was the backbone of her family, guiding them through treacherous times after her husband's death. Her influence was so profound that you might argue she was the original Tiger Mom, raising a son who'd unify the Mongol tribes and shake up the world order like a medieval rock star. And then there's Turajin Khatun, who ruled the Mongol Empire as regent after her husband Urjideh Khan's death. Picture her juggling political machinations like a seasoned pro, maintaining the empire's cohesion while her sons bickered over succession. Forget any notion of a shrinking violet. Turajin was more like a velvet glove with an iron fist inside. She navigated the cutthroat world of Mongol politics with a savvy that would make Machiavelli nod in approval. But how did this society, so often portrayed as male-dominated, allow women such significant power? Here's where the Mongols broke the mold. Their societal norms were a curious mix of rigid roles and surprising flexibility, a bit like a medieval yoga class. In the Mongol world, competence trumped gender. If you were capable, you led, and if you led, you wielded power. This adaptability wasn't just a quirk, it was a key ingredient in the Mongol recipe for success. However, let's not get too carried away with the romantic notion of gender equality on the steppes. Sure, women could rule, but they were also expected to manage households, milk the livestock, and handle the daily grind of nomadic life. Their roles were as multifaceted as a Swiss army knife, and they were expected to perform with the deftness of a circus performer juggling flaming torches. So while there was room for women to rise to power, the societal expectations were as heavy as a Mongol warhorse in full gallop. Speaking of expectations, let's talk about the Yaf, that legendary code of laws that held the Mongol world together like medieval duct tape. It was a legal system that was both draconian and surprisingly progressive. For instance, the Yasa demanded absolute loyalty and forbade the betrayal of a Khan, with penalties as severe as a 13th century Yelp review, swift and brutal. But it also promoted religious tolerance, a rare gem in the era's treasure chest of bigotry and zealotry. The Mongols understood that diversity could be a strength, not a weakness. They welcomed everyone from Buddhists to Muslims into their fold, creating a melting pot that was as rich as their conquests. And while we're myth-busting, let's address the notion that Mongol society was a free-for-all of chaos and plunder. Sure, there were raids, nobody's denying that. But underneath the surface was an intricate network of relationships and alliances that kept the empire from imploding. Imagine a particularly intense game of chess, where every move was calculated, and every alliance was both a shield and a sword. The Mongols knew that to rule effectively, they needed more than just brute force. They needed diplomacy, cunning, and a strategy that could adapt quicker than a steppe windstorm. It's no wonder that the Mongol Empire managed to expand like a well-watered weed, covering 9 million square miles at its peak. Yet, this wasn't just about accumulating land like some medieval monopoly game. It was about creating a legacy, a testament to the power of adaptability in a world that was as volatile as a pot of boiling arag. The steppes taught them to be resourceful, and they applied that lesson to empire building with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. Now, let's zoom in on the familial clan structure, the backbone of Mongol society. Picture it as an elaborate family tree with branches that could intertwine, twist, and sometimes snap under the weight of ambition and betrayal. Clans were the basic building blocks of social order, each with its own hierarchy and internal politics. Loyalty to one's clan was paramount, and marriage alliances were more than just romantic entanglements. They were strategic moves on a political chessboard. And speaking of clans, Genghis Khan, born Temujin, was a master at manipulating these familial connections. He didn't just unite the Mongol tribes through sheer force. He did it by forging alliances and creating a shared identity among disparate groups. His secret weapon, the Anda system, a form of sworn brotherhood that transcended blood ties. It was like an ancient version of LinkedIn, creating a network of trusted allies who would fight to the death for each other. And while the image of the Mongols as a horde of rampaging barbarians is certainly dramatic, the reality is far more nuanced. They were an empire of contrasts, a society that could be both rigid and flexible, brutal and enlightened. They understood that to thrive in a world that was often as desolate as the steppes they roamed, they needed to harness every advantage, whether it came from the strength of their warriors or the wisdom of their leaders, regardless of gender. And as you ride along with this tale, remember that the Mongols were more than just conquerors. They were architects of a new world order. They built bridges between cultures, facilitated trade, and spread ideas like the wind spreads seeds across the plains. Their legacy is one of innovation and adaptation, a reminder that sometimes the fiercest warriors are also the most cunning strategists. So stay tuned, because the Mongol saga is far from over, and the next chapter promises to be as thrilling as a gallop across the open steppe. And speaking of galloping across the open steppe, let's dive into the Mongol political landscape, where diplomacy was as much a weapon as the sword. If you thought Mongol politics were all about brawn, think again. The Khans were masters of the diplomatic game, playing it with the finesse of a chess grandmaster and the ruthlessness of a seasoned poker player. They didn't just overwhelm their enemies with sheer force. They outmaneuvered them with alliances, treaties, and the occasional well-placed dagger in the back. First, let's talk alliances. The Mongols were the original networkers, long before LinkedIn made it cool. They understood that to conquer the world, you needed friends, or at least frenemies. Genghis Khan, the maestro himself, forged alliances with tribes and kingdoms that were as shaky as a yurt in a windstorm. He married off his daughters like chess pieces, securing ties with powerful leaders across the Eurasian plains. Each marriage was a political maneuver, transforming potential rivals into allies faster than you can say diplomatic immunity. But don't be fooled into thinking it was all about marriage and handshakes. The Mongols were just as skilled at the art of intimidation. When Genghis Khan sent emissaries to the Khwarezmian Empire, offering trade and friendship, the Shah made the mistake of treating them like spam emails. The result? A Mongol invasion that wiped Khwarezm off the map with a swiftness that would make even a modern blitzkrieg look like a leisurely stroll. Lesson learned. Never ghost a Khan's envoy unless you want your empire to become a footnote in history. Now, let's bust the myth of the Mongols as mere destroyers. Sure, they left a trail of conquered cities in their wake, but they were also builders, architects of a new world order. Under Mongol rule, cities like Samarkand and Baghdad became cultural melting pots, buzzing with trade and scholarship. The Mongols didn't just pillage, they patronized, encouraging the exchange of ideas and innovations. They were like the world's most unlikely patrons of the arts, funding scholars and scientists who would go on to make breakthroughs in fields as diverse as astronomy and medicine. Take the Pax Mongolica, for instance. This period of relative peace across the Mongol Empire allowed for unprecedented economic growth and cultural exchange. It was the medieval equivalent of a global village, with merchants traveling from Europe to China under the watchful eyes of Mongol patrols. The Silk Road became a superhighway of commerce, and cities flourished as trade hubs. The Mongols understood that an empire couldn't survive on conquest alone. It needed prosperity, and prosperity demanded stability. But let's not sugarcoat it. Mongol rule wasn't all sunshine and trade winds. For many, being conquered by the Mongols was a brutal experience, akin to being hit by a hurricane and then taxed for the cleanup. They imposed harsh levies on conquered territories, and resistance was met with swift and often brutal suppression. The Mongols maintained control through a combination of fear and pragmatism, ensuring that rebellions were as rare as an ice cream stand in the Gobi Desert. Yet their governance wasn't just about maintaining order through fear. The Mongols were surprisingly progressive in their administration, integrating local customs and retaining local leaders who were willing to play ball. This wasn't just enlightened rule, it was practical governance. Why reinvent the wheel when you can just grease the existing ones? This flexibility allowed the Mongols to maintain control over a vast and diverse empire, where cultures and languages collided like tectonic plates. Now, let's fast forward to the geopolitical consequences of the Mongol conquests, which still echo through the corridors of history today. The Mongols didn't just reshape the map. They redrew the rules of engagement. Their empire facilitated the spread of technologies and ideas that would eventually spark the Renaissance in Europe. The compass, gunpowder, and printing technology all found their way westward, carried along the trade routes established by the Mongols. It's like they were the original tech disruptors, only with more horses and fewer board meetings. The Mongol conquests also had a profound impact on the Islamic world, leading to shifts in power that would reverberate for centuries. The destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was a seismic event, shattering a center of Islamic power and prompting a realignment of political and religious authority. The vacuum left by the Mongols' devastating campaigns paved the way for the rise of new powers like the Ottoman Empire. which would go on to become a major player on the world stage. And let's not forget the psychological impact of the Mongol conquests. The memory of Mongol invasions lingered like a dark cloud over Europe and Asia, influencing military strategies and fortification designs for generations. The fear of the Mongol horde became a part of the cultural fabric, a reminder of the thin line between civilization and chaos. It was a lesson in humility for the world's greatest kingdoms, a reminder that no wall was too high and no army too mighty to withstand the Mongol tide. So the next time you picture the Mongol Empire, think beyond the battlefield. See it as a complex tapestry of diplomacy and destruction, innovation and oppression. The Mongols were not just conquerors. They were architects of a new world order, shaping the course of history with a blend of brutality and brilliance. And while their empire eventually crumbled, its legacy endures, a testament to the power of vision and the enduring impact of those who dare to redraw the map. Stay tuned, because the Mongol saga has more twists and turns than a steppe windstorm, and the story is far from over. So, where does this Mongol roller coaster leave us? Well, the Mongol Empire, stretching its tendrils across continents, did more than redraw maps and spread a little chaos. It left an indelible mark that resonates in ways both grand and granular. Imagine a legacy that still echoes in the corridors of power, the classrooms of strategy, and the imaginations of filmmakers and novelists alike. Yes, these horse-riding nomads from the steppes have managed to keep us both terrified and fascinated for centuries. Talk about leaving a lasting impression. First, let's dissect the fear factor. The Mongols were the medieval bogeymen, the kind that made kingdoms shudder and walls quake. Their rapid, relentless conquests painted a picture of unstoppable momentum. It's no wonder that the term horde became synonymous with chaos and destruction. The psychological impact of this was immense. European cities beefed up their defenses, new military strategies were devised, and the very idea of invincibility was tossed out the nearest arrow slit. The Mongols were a living, breathing lesson that no power was too great to be toppled. And that, my friends, is a lesson in humility that still resonates today. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. The Mongols, in their own chaotic way, were also architects of connection. The Silk Road, under Mongol protection, became a superhighway of commerce and culture. Goods, ideas, and inventions flowed like a river through the empire. This exchange didn't just fill coffers, it sparked innovation and cross-cultural fertilization. Think of it as the world's most intense networking event, where the guest list included traders, scholars, and artisans. The Mongols didn't just break things, they built bridges, albeit sometimes over the ruins of what they'd smashed. Now, let's zoom in on their influence on modern warfare and statecraft. The Mongols were the original blitzkrieg artists, masters of speed and surprise. Their tactics, hit fast, hit hard, and keep moving, resonate in military academies even today. They understood the power of mobility in psychological warfare long before it was cool. Their use of horse-mounted archers redefined cavalry tactics, and the concept of a mobile army that lives off the land. That's a page straight from the Mongol playbook, one that generals have been cribbing ever since. Their statecraft was equally groundbreaking. The Mongols knew that ruling a vast, diverse empire required more than just an iron fist. They promoted meritocracy, valuing ability over aristocratic pedigree. This pragmatism allowed them to harness the talents of conquered peoples, integrating them into their administration. The Mongol Empire was a precursor to modern multinational governance, with its emphasis on pragmatism, adaptation, and a surprising degree of tolerance. They were, in their own way, early adopters of the idea that diversity can be a strength, not a liability. So why do the Mongols still captivate us? Why are they both vilified and admired? It's a classic case of love and fear, a dichotomy that speaks volumes about human nature. The Mongols represent the ultimate paradox. They were both destroyers and unifiers, barbarians and visionaries. In them, we see the duality of power, the capacity to create and annihilate, to oppress and liberate. This complexity makes them a mirror reflecting our own struggles with the ethical implications of power. Their story also challenges our romantic notions of history. We love a good hero's journey, but the Mongols remind us that history is often messier than a yurt after a windstorm. It's a tapestry woven from threads of conquest, commerce, and culture. By embracing the full spectrum of their legacy, we gain a richer understanding of the past and its impact on the present. In the end, the Mongols were not just conquerors. They were cultural brokers, strategic innovators, and unwitting globalizers. Their empire may have crumbled, but their influence endures, a testament to the power of adaptability and vision. They remind us that history is a living, breathing entity, constantly reshaping itself in the light of new discoveries and insights. And as we continue to unravel the complex legacy of the Mongols, we're reminded that history is not just about what happened. It's about understanding why it matters. So, as you drift off into the world of dreams, ponder this. The Mongols were more than just a force of nature. They were a force of history, shaping the world in ways that continue to ripple through time. The medieval serf's life was about as glamorous as a mud pie on a rainy day. While some folks today fantasize about medieval times as if they were one long Renaissance fair, for the average serf, life was less jousting in shining armor and more endless drudgery in a potato sack. If you were a serf in the Middle Ages, let's say the 14th century, just for kicks, you were basically the human equivalent of a sticky note on the great board of feudal obligations. Your job: stick around and work your lord's land from dawn until your back screamed for mercy at dusk. The feudal system was the medieval version of a pyramid scheme, only with more dirt and less money. At the top, you had your king, lording over all like a medieval CEO. Below him, a hierarchy of nobles and knights, each with their own slice of the kingdom pie. And at the bottom, the serfs, who were more like the crust than any juicy filling. This hierarchy wasn't just a suggestion, it was the law of the land. If you were born a serf, you stayed a serf. No upward mobility here, folks. The only rising you did was from bed to field. Let's talk rights, or in the serf's case, the distinct lack of them. Serfs were bound to the land like a bad decision you can't shake off. In legal terms, they were unfree, which sounds like the medieval version of being perpetually grounded. You couldn't leave the land without your lord's permission, and if you tried to sneak off, you'd likely find yourself dragged back with an extra dose of manual labor as punishment. Your lord had the right to approve your marriage, a charming little quirk that made wedding planning about as romantic as a tax audit. And what did serfs get in return for their hard work and limited freedom? Well, they got to keep a fraction of what they grew, just enough to not starve, and the privilege of protection from bandits. Though, given the average lord's ability to protect anything, this was like being assured your cardboard shield would hold up in a sword fight. Now, let's dive into a day in the life of our medieval serf. Picture waking up at the crack of dawn, not because you're a morning person, but because the rooster's your alarm clock, and your lord expects you in the fields before the sun's fully up. Breakfast. A slab of bread, maybe a bit of cheese if the mice haven't gotten to it first. This was no continental breakfast. It was more like continental drift, slow, and not much to look forward to. Your day involved back-breaking labor, plowing, sowing, harvesting, and repeating the cycle ad nauseum. The tools you had to work with were basic. Think sticks and stones rather than anything remotely resembling modern machinery. If you were lucky, you might have a plow, but more likely, you'd be relying on a trusty ox. And by trusty, I mean an ox that was as exhausted as you were. In between working your lord's fields, you had your own little patch of land to tend. This was your lifeline, your chance to grow enough food to feed your family. If you had kids, they weren't off at school or day camp. They were right there with you, learning the fine art of weeding and hoeing. Take your daughter to work day. That was every day, and it was less about bonding and more about survival. Even the seasons weren't on your side. Winters were harsh and food storage was a gamble. You'd stockpile whatever meager harvest you could scrape together, praying it lasted until spring. If not, well, at least fasting was in vogue with certain religious practices, right? Let's not forget the taxes. Oh, the taxes. You owed your lord a portion of everything you harvested. And then there were tithes to the church. Basically, everyone got a cut, except for you. If your lord felt particularly generous, he might throw a feast now and then. But don't get too excited. The leftovers were your reward, and you'd be fighting for scraps with the other serfs like it was a medieval Black Friday sale. Through it all, serfs remained the backbone of the feudal economy. They were the ones who made sure the fields were ploughed, the crops were harvested, and the lords had enough food to keep their banquets bustling. Yet they lived lives that were nasty, brutish, and short. The average lifespan for a serf, about 30 to 40 years, assuming plague, famine, or an overzealous lord didn't get you first. So next time you hear someone waxing poetic about the good old days of knights and castles, remember the serfs. They were the ones who built that world, one backbreaking day at a time, without ever seeing a hint of the romance or adventure we so love to imagine. And speaking of those serfs who toiled away in the proverbial hamster wheel of medieval society, let's pivot to the economic straitjacket that kept them there. If you thought modern life was a financial juggling act, wait until you hear what these folks dealt with. Picture this. A serf's wallet was emptier than a medieval promise of prosperity. Taxes and rents were the double whammy that ensured their pockets were permanently drafty. The lords, much like today's tax collectors, with an added penchant for medieval law, demanded their due in a variety of creative ways. First up, you've got the infamous maltold. Sounds like a medieval dessert, but I assure you, it wasn't anything sweet. This delightful term referred to a set of taxes deemed unfair even by the standards of the time. Surprising, right? When even your fellow feudal overlords are side-eyeing your tax policies, you know you're onto something special. The maltold was essentially a tax on top of a tax, a surcharge added because, well, why not? It was like being charged extra for the privilege of paying your already exorbitant rent. Now, let's talk about what these taxes and rents actually meant for our beleaguered serf. In monetary terms, a serf might be required to cough up as much as half of their produce to their lord. Yep, 50% of everything they managed to grow with their blood, sweat, and very literal tears. The other half wasn't exactly pocket change, as you'd still have to tithe to the church. So, after the lord and the church took their cuts, you were left with the medieval equivalent of crumbs. And guess what? You didn't pay in just crops. Oh no, the system was far more versatile. You could also pony up in cash or labor. The cash option was about as realistic as a dragon sighting, since actual money in the hands of serfs was as scarce as a quiet medieval tavern. Coins jingled in the pockets of merchants and lords, not the folks slaving away to make the bread that everyone else ate. So labor it was. If you couldn't pay in wheat or barley, you paid in sweat. Even if you did manage to scrape together a few pennies, they'd be gone faster than you could say. Feudal fairness. This vicious cycle made saving for a rainy day about as plausible as time travel. Serfs lived hand-to-mouth, and the only thing they could count on was the certainty of more taxes. The lords, ever the entrepreneurs, constantly invented new ways to ensure the serfs stayed broke. Let's say the king rolled out a decree to ease the burden. Our beloved lords would just find a loophole or invent a new fee to take its place. It was like playing whack-a-mole, but with your livelihood. For example, the tallage, a tax paid directly to the lord, was another thorn in the serf side. This was a bit of a wild card, imposed whenever the lord felt like padding his coffers. There was no fixed rate, so the lord could decide that this year the price of serfdom was a new jousting field. It was as unpredictable as a medieval weather forecast, and just as unpleasant when it hit. Serfs were also subject to the merchant, a fee that had to be paid when a serf's daughter got married. Yes, you heard right, simply for the joy of getting rid of one of your own to another family. It was like receiving a wedding bill instead of a gift registry. If your family was lucky enough to have a daughter of marrying age, you had to cough up more money just to let her walk down the aisle. The logic behind this? Well, it was a way to compensate the lord for losing a laborer. Because, you know, it's not like you needed that extra pair of hands at home, or anything. The economic constraints didn't end there. Let's not forget the boon work, which was essentially unpaid labor during harvest time. Imagine being forced to clerk in overtime with zero compensation, just because your lord needed his grain collected pronto. It's like your boss asking you to work weekends for free, except instead of emails, you're bundled with sheaves of wheat. To add insult to injury, serfs were often forced to use the lord's mill, oven, or wine press, for which they had to pay a fee. It's the medieval equivalent of being forced to shop at a specific grocery store and being charged extra for the privilege. And if that wasn't enough, you might be hit with a fee for using the lord's bridge or road. Basically, if you thought of leaving your hovel, you were likely to encounter a toll. It was the land of the free, just not for the serfs. These economic barriers ensured that serfs remained perpetually at the bottom rung of the ladder. The system was designed to keep them in their place, ensuring they had just enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. The lords, meanwhile, luxuriated in their wealth. oblivious to the struggles of those who made their lavish lifestyles possible. It was a tale as old as time, those who have, and those who have not, with the latter doing all the heavy lifting. And yet, despite the grim economic reality, the myth of the noble serf persists. There's an enduring romanticism about the simplicity of medieval life, a notion that people were happier with less. But the reality was more akin to a pre-modern circus, where the performers were also the audience, and the show never ended. The serfs were trapped in a relentless cycle of subsistence, with each generation inheriting the same burdens as the last. As we wrap up this leg of our journey through the muck and mire of serfdom, remember this. While the castles and feasting halls of the medieval world may have dazzled, the true story was in the fields and the faces of those who worked them. Theirs was a life of struggle, of survival, and of a system that seemed determined to keep them right where they were, grinding away for someone else's gain. But the tale of the serf is far from over, and as we move forward, we'll see just how this system, with all its complexity and hardship, managed to endure for centuries. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the world of the medieval serf, exploring the social and political dynamics that kept them rooted, and sometimes, just sometimes, allowed them to rise. As we continue our journey through the not-so-enchanted forest of medieval serfdom, let's dive headfirst into the social and political quagmire that kept serfs stuck like a fly in a particularly sticky web. If you've ever felt like you're stuck on the treadmill of modern life, just imagine a medieval version where the treadmill is made of mud, your shoes are non-existent, and the incline is perpetually set to uphill. Let's start with the manorial court, essentially the medieval equivalent of your local small claims court, but with more mud and fewer lawyers. This was where justice was supposed to be served, although for serfs, it was more like being served a cold dish of better luck next time. The lord of the manor presided over these courts, and spoiler alert, he wasn't exactly impartial. Think of it as playing a game of Monopoly, where the banker also gets to make up the rules as you go along. Serfs could be dragged into the manorial court for a multitude of reasons. Maybe they were caught stealing a chicken, though who could blame them when poultry was basically medieval gold, or perhaps they dared to speak ill of the lord's fashion choices. The punishments were often as creative as a medieval bard's ballad. Fines were the Gotha penalty, because, serfs were just swimming in spare change. If you couldn't pay, and let's face it, you probably couldn't, you'd find yourself doing extra labor or, in some cases, facing public humiliation. Yes, nothing says justice, like standing in the stocks while the village kids practice their aim with rotten tomatoes. The decisions of the manorial court were final, and they served as a constant reminder of the serfs' lack of autonomy. These courts underscored a fundamental truth of medieval life. If you were a serf, your life was controlled by forces as immutable as the laws of physics. Your lord was both judge and jury, and you were always, inevitably, the defendant. But even the most downtrodden serfs had their breaking points, moments when the scales tipped from passive acceptance to active rebellion. Enter the peasant revolts, the medieval equivalent of shaking a fist at the heavens, or at least at the nearest manor house. These uprisings were rare, but they were like the medieval version of a rock concert, a loud, chaotic, and ultimately futile attempt to change the tune. Take the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a particularly fiery chapter in England's history. It all kicked off when King Richard Roman II, in a dazzling display of financial acumen, decided to impose a poll tax, essentially a flat-rate tax that made as much sense as a chocolate teapot. This tax hit the serfs hard, and when the collectors came knocking, they might as well have been wearing a target on their backs. The revolt spread like wildfire, with serfs and peasants from Kent and Essex marching on London, banners waving, battle cries echoing. It was like a medieval flash mob, except this one was armed and decidedly less choreographed. Led by the charismatic Wat Tyler, the rebels managed to capture the Tower of London and even executed the Archbishop of Canterbury. Yes, they literally stormed the gates, swords drawn, proving that when pushed to the limit, even the most downtrodden serf could channel their inner action hero, albeit one with decidedly less plot armor. They demanded everything from the abolition of serfdom to the end of the poll tax, essentially asking for a complete overhaul of the feudal system. And what did they get for their troubles? A meeting with the king himself, which seemed like a promising step. But in a twist worthy of a medieval soap opera, Wat Tyler was killed during negotiations, and the rebellion crumbled faster than a stale piece of bread. The king, showing an impressive grasp of medieval PR, promised reforms but swiftly reneged once the dust settled. The message was clear: revolt, and you'll be met with the sharp end of a sword or the dull end of a broken promise. Despite the apparent futility, these revolts were more than just footnotes in history. They were a reminder that even the most oppressed could dream of a better future, and sometimes, just sometimes, those dreams could shake the very foundations of power. Peasants' revolt showed that serfs weren't just passive players in their own lives. They were capable of challenging authority, even if the odds were stacked as high as a lord's banquet table. The social and political environment that kept serfs chained to their plots of land was as intricate as a medieval tapestry, and just as tangled. At its heart was a rigid caste system that dictated every aspect of a serf's life, from the fields they tilled to the clothes they wore. Mobility. Forget it. A serf had about as much chance of climbing the social ladder as a snail racing up a castle wall. And let's not even talk about personal autonomy. The average serf had fewer choices than a medieval menu, and most of them involved hard labor. Decisions like marriage, travel, or even what to plant in their meager plots were subject to the whims of their lord. It was a world where freedom was an abstract concept, as distant as the stars in the night sky. Despite the heavy chains of feudalism, there was a certain resilience in the serfs' lives. They found ways to carve out small victories, to create communities and traditions that defied the oppressive system. From folk songs that poked fun at their overlords to secret gatherings where they could speak freely, serfs managed to maintain a sense of identity and solidarity. They were a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure, to find light even in the darkest of times. So, while the castles and knights of medieval lore may capture our imaginations, it's the serfs who offer a deeper story, a story of survival, of resistance, and of the relentless pursuit of a better tomorrow. As we continue to explore the world of the medieval serf, remember that behind every plough, behind every harvest, was a person with hopes, dreams, and an unyielding will to persevere. Stay tuned as we delve further into this fascinating, if often overlooked, chapter of history. There's still much more to uncover, and who knows what other tales of grit and determination await us along the way. Now that we've unraveled some of the knottier threads of medieval serfdom, let's lace up our boots and wade into the muck of myth-busting. The romantic vision of pastoral life, with its rolling fields and simple joys, is as appealing as the idea of zero-calorie chocolate, enticing, but ultimately a fantasy. Picture the Middle Ages, often painted in modern storytelling as a time of rustic charm and bucolic serenity. But the truth behind this image is as gritty as a medieval toothache. First off, let's debunk the notion of their idyllic simple life that has somehow wormed its way into our imaginations like a particularly persistent earworm. In reality, medieval serfs were more likely to be found battling the elements than basking in some pastoral paradise. Disease was a constant companion, lurking around every corner like a nosy neighbor with a penchant for spreading misery. The Black Death alone wiped out an estimated 25 million people in Europe between 1347 and 1351. That's about a third of the population, a statistic that's as sobering as a medieval ale. Famine, too, was a frequent visitor, turning dinner tables into barren wastelands. Crop failures, often due to uncooperative weather, were as common as a medieval bard's tall tales. When the grain didn't grow, neither did the hope of a full belly. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 was a particularly brutal period, where incessant rains led to widespread crop failures. As a result, food prices skyrocketed, and desperation turned people to eating everything from bark to shoe leather. If there was ever a time to appreciate your local grocery store, this would be it. Now, let's talk living conditions. The image of a quaint cottage with smoke curling from the chimney is charming, sure, but the reality was a far cry from this cozy scene. Serf homes, often little more than wooden shacks with thatched roofs, were about as comfortable as a medieval dungeon. These hovels were usually one-room affairs, shared with livestock for warmth, a fact that was less about quaintness and more about necessity. Picture a cramped space filled with people, animals, and the delightful aroma of Well, let's not get into that. In terms of health, forget about your average medieval serf enjoying a long and healthy life. Medical care was rudimentary at best, with treatments that were more superstition than science. Got a fever? Try bloodletting, a practice that involved draining some of your blood in the hope that your body would right itself. It was about as effective as trying to fix a sinking ship with a bucket. And with an average lifespan of about 30 to 40 years, most serfs didn't have to worry about retirement plans or midlife crises. Yet, despite these realities, the myth of the simple, happy medieval life persists, fueled by pop culture's penchant for rose-tinted glasses. Movies and TV shows love to romanticize the Middle Ages, presenting a world where everyone lives in harmony with nature, free of modern woes. But for the serfs, life was less, Little House on the Prairie, and more, Survivor, medieval edition. The appeal of this fantasy is understandable. Who wouldn't want to escape the hustle and bustle of modern life? But let's not kid ourselves. Even in the most picturesque village, the daily grind was as relentless as a medieval tax collector. To add a dash of historical flavor, let's look at some primary sources that reveal the less than idyllic truth. Manorial records, those dusty tomes of legal and economic transactions, paint a picture that's far from pastoral. These documents, meticulously kept by lords to track their wealth and assets, include entries about fines, disputes, and obligations that serfs faced. They're like the medieval version of a ledger, and they show just how deeply serfs were entrenched in a system that offered little room for maneuver. Chronicles and annals of the time, written by monks and scholars, also give us glimpses into the harsh realities. They tell of harsh winters, failed harvests, and the constant threat of disease. These records are a reminder that while the Middle Ages might seem romantic from a distance, up close they were more like a medieval soap opera, full of drama, hardship, and the occasional plague. As we sift through these historical breadcrumbs, it's clear that the romantic view of medieval life is more fiction than fact. But there's a reason these myths endure. They offer us an escape, a chance to imagine a simpler time, free from the stress and complexity of modern life. They speak to a longing for connection, for community, for a world where people lived in harmony with the land. It's a beautiful dream, even if it's one based on shaky foundations. Yet, as we've seen, the true story of the serf is one of resilience in the face of adversity. It's a tale of survival, of finding small joys amidst great struggles. While the myths may paint an appealing picture, the reality is far richer and more complex. It's a story that deserves to be told, not just for its historical value, but for the lessons it offers about human strength and endurance. So, as we continue to unravel the threads of medieval serfdom, let's keep our eyes open to both the legend and the truth. There's still much more to explore in this tangled tapestry of history, and who knows what other stories we'll uncover along the way. Stay with us as we dive deeper into the world of the serfs, where every day was a battle, and every victory was hard-won. The journey is far from over, and the next chapter promises to be just as revealing as the last. As we peel back the layers of the medieval tapestry, the serf story continues with small victories that, though seemingly inconsequential, set the stage for monumental shifts in European society. Picture this. A serf, knee-deep in mud and obligations, manages a quiet rebellion by simply surviving another day, a small act of defiance against a system designed to keep them downtrodden. These daily acts of persistence were the seeds of change, slowly eroding the foundations of serfdom like water carving through stone. Let's dive into the economics of these changes. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was buzzing with new ideas, much like a medieval marketplace on market day. The Black Death had swept through, leaving behind a drastically reduced workforce, and with it, the leverage that serfs needed to negotiate better terms. Supply and demand. The serfs may not have had economics degrees, but they understood the power of scarcity. With fields lying fallow and lords desperate to fill them, serfs began to demand wages for their labor, a radical shift from their previous status as unpaid laborers. It was like moving from a volunteer gig to a paid internship, still not ideal, but a step in the right direction. And speaking of economics, let's not forget the Statute of Laborers of 1351, an attempt by the English crown to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Imagine trying to put a lid on a boiling pot. It was an effort destined to fail, and fail it did. The statute was about as effective as a paper shield in a sword fight, and serfs found ways to circumvent it. They bartered their labor for goods or services, creating a shadow economy that the lords couldn't control. It was serf ingenuity at its finest, a precursor to the gig economy, medieval style. But the changes weren't just economic. The social fabric of Europe was shifting too. The peasants' revolt, though suppressed, had sown the seeds of discontent across the continent. Serfs were beginning to see themselves not just as subjects, but as individuals with rights, or at least the potential for them. This was a revolutionary idea in a world where one's status was supposedly fixed from birth. The echoes of these revolts reverberated through the centuries, much like a particularly catchy medieval tune, influencing later movements that demanded even greater freedoms. As serfs slowly gained more economic power, their social standing began to inch upwards, albeit at the speed of a snail on a lazy afternoon. By the 15th century, many serfs had transitioned from bonded laborers to tenant farmers, paying rent rather than fulfilling labor obligations. It was like upgrading from a flip phone to a smartphone, still a phone, but with more options at your fingertips. This shift laid the groundwork for the rise of a more mobile labor force, one that would eventually demand and receive greater rights and protections. The dissolution of serfdom was a patchwork affair, differing from region to region, much like the varied dialects that peppered medieval Europe. In England, serfdom was largely gone by the end of the 16th century, while in Eastern Europe it lingered stubbornly into the 19th century. Each step toward freedom was hard-won, often involving legal battles, negotiations, and occasionally outright rebellion. It was a long, slow march toward a more equitable society, but one that would eventually lead to the modern concepts of labor rights and personal freedom. And let's not overlook the cultural contributions of the serfs. Their music, folklore, and traditions enriched European culture, leaving a legacy that continues to flavor our understanding of the Middle Ages. From the haunting strains of folk songs to the earthy humor of their tales, serfs left an indelible mark on the cultural landscape. They were the unsung artists of the medieval world, their stories and songs a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. So, what does this all mean for us today? Well, the legacy of serfdom can be seen in the development of labor rights, like a distant ancestor whose quirks you unexpectedly inherit. The struggles of medieval serfs laid the groundwork for workers' rights movements, which have shaped the labor laws we, mostly, enjoy today. The 8-hour workday, the weekend, and minimum wage laws all have roots in the long fight for fair treatment that began in those muddy fields. And let's face it, the universal dread of Monday mornings. You can thank the serfs for that too. Their grueling work week set the stage for our own, with its relentless return to labor after a brief respite. It's a reminder that while we've come a long way, the echoes of the past are never too far behind. As we close this chapter on medieval serfdom, let's not forget the lessons it offers. The serfs may not have been the knights or nobles of popular imagination, but their story is no less heroic. It's a tale of endurance, of finding moments of joy amidst hardship, and of small victories that, collectively, reshaped a continent. So next time you're slogging through your own daily grind, spare a thought for the serfs who paved the way. They remind us that change, however slow, is always possible, and that even the smallest acts of defiance can ripple outward, creating waves of transformation.